Jon Snow stood in the throne room of the Red Keep, Daenerys Targaryen's lifeless body resting gently in his arms as the rush of recent events crashed against his consciousness. A swirl of emotions, grief, guilt, relief filled him like a brutal northern storm. Only moments before, he had plunged a dagger into the heart of the woman who had once been his queen, the woman he had loved because he believed it was the only way to save the Seven Kingdoms from tyranny. Her silver hair spilled across his fingers like moonlight over dark water, and he could still hear the faint echoes of Drogon's anguished roar reverberating in the massive chamber. Yet even amid the horror of his act, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He had done what he must, as his father Ned Stark would have done if faced with such a choice. That did little to soothe the ache in his heart, but he knew some burdens were meant to be carried. In the hush that followed Drogon's fiery lament, Jon bowed his head over Daenerys's still form and whispered a final apology. Then he gently laid her down onto the cold stone floor. The sound of heavily armored footsteps echoed from the corridor behind him. The Unsullied would come, Grey Worm leading them with single-minded fury, and Jon knew there would be no clemency for him. He had, after all, killed their queen. He rose, feeling the weight of duty and destiny press on him like an anvil. At first, he considered letting them take him away, considered paying the price for his deed. But then he remembered the thousands of innocent lives lost in King's Landing's recent conflagration. He remembered Tyrion's warning and Arya's words about the madness lurking behind Daenerys's unwavering conviction. He thought of Sansa and the North she had fought so hard to protect. Above all, he thought of the living who must still be saved from more bloodshed. Perhaps no one else would accept him now, neither as a king nor a hero, but he had a duty to stay alive, if only to prevent more tragedy. His decision made, he broke into a run, steps echoing in the vast hall as Grey Worm's voice boomed down the corridor. He barely escaped the throne room, fighting a tangle of conflicting loyalties as he raced through the labyrinthine passages of the Red Keep. Still wearing his blood-stained clothes, the metallic scent of Daenerys's blood clung to him, a constant reminder of what he had done and why. Outside, the city lay in ruins, black smoke drifting into a sky bruised by the fires of war. Uncertainty twisted inside him like a blade. Where would he go? Who would help him? He had no illusions that the Unsullied, the Dothraki, or even many in King's Landing would spare him. To some, he would be a hero who ended a reign of terror before it truly began. To others, he was a traitor who had assassinated the rightful queen in a moment of cowardice. His feet carried him to the gates of the Red Keep, where he found what remained of the Northmen sent to King's Landing. Their numbers were depleted, many having perished in the city's savage downfall or deserted in the chaos. Jon could see in their eyes the toll the last few days had taken, a haunted, exhausted look that matched his own. He searched for someone he knew, and there, leaning against a broken cart, was Tormund Giantsbane, his red hair matted with dirt and ash. Their eyes met across the distance, and the big man hurried toward Jon, relief mingling with shock. Tormund opened his mouth to speak, but Jon wordlessly shook his head, urging him to silence. He glanced around, wary of hidden eyes that might see him. Together, the two men ducked through narrow alleys, stepping over rubble and moving silently until they reached a more secluded spot amid the ruined houses of the city. Tormund asked no immediate questions, though the sorrow and confusion in his gaze spoke volumes. He simply led Jon away from the epicenter of chaos. They passed the bodies of men, women, and children in the streets, some burned beyond recognition, some lying in the broken remains of what had once been homes or shops. The devastation weighed on Jon's mind like an immense, inescapable burden. He recalled Daenerys's triumphant face astride Drogon, the unstoppable force of dragonfire turning buildings and flesh to ash. He tried not to look too closely at any one corpse because each face seemed to accuse him. He had loved her, and still he had killed her. Could he have done more to stop the slaughter before it began? They slipped out of a side gate of the city, the guards either dead or fled. Smoke curled in the distant sky, a final testament to Daenerys's conquest. Once beyond the walls, Tormund led Jon to a small clearing near the muddy remains of an old camp. They both took a moment to breathe, the sting of ash still thick in their throats. Only then did Tormund finally speak. "I saw Drogon fly away," he said quietly, in a voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Saw him carry her off." "What happened, Jon?" Tormund's gaze flicked to Jon's blood-stained shirt, then back to Jon's eyes. Jon took a moment, gathering what remained of his composure. He spoke in a low tone of the events in the throne room, of Tyrion's pleas, of his own internal war between love and duty. "I had no choice," Jon murmured. "She wanted to remake the world in fire and blood. She thought it was justice." He paused, throat constricting around the weight of it. "I had to do it, Tormund." Tormund listened, his expression grave. When Jon finished, he sighed, pressing a heavy hand to Jon's shoulder. "I've seen the dead come back to life," Tormund said, his voice carrying all the bleakness of the far north. "I've seen armies of ice and a dragon made of blue fire. I've seen things that'd make most men piss themselves. But this, I suppose it had to be done." He gave Jon's shoulder a squeeze. "You have that look in your eyes again, the one you had after Harhome, after the Battle of the Bastards. There's more you plan to do, isn't there?" Jon's shoulders tensed. He glanced over at the smoking city walls. "I can't stay here. They'll be hunting for me, and the lords, they won't trust me after this. Tyrion told me once that sometimes duty is the death of love. I've killed any chance of peace within these walls for myself." A breeze rustled the charred grass, carrying the reek of smoke and blood. Jon's voice dropped. "But there is something left for me beyond the wall. I don't know if I have it in me to rule or to fight more wars. Maybe it's time I return to the land of snow and ice." Tormund's face brightened in the midst of so much despair. "We came south to fight, but my heart's always in the true north. It calls to me like a howling wind. I only stuck around to keep an eye on you, you know. Ghost is waiting for us back at Winterfell, or so I heard, might have gone north. The little wolf might have taken him to the wall. We can find him, then go north for good." There was a question in Tormund's tone, one final chance for Jon to back away. Jon recognized it and gave a solemn nod. "Aye," he said. "We'll head for Winterfell. Then we'll go beyond the wall." Within the hour, they had scavenged supplies from the wreckage. Jon took a dark cloak to hide his face as much as possible while Tormund slung a battered pack over his shoulder. They slipped away under the cloud of chaos that still enveloped King's Landing, staying off the main roads, moving only by night. Over the next few days, they traveled at a grueling pace. Few dared to confront them on the roads, given their grim expressions and Tormund's imposing presence. Those they did meet were refugees trying to escape the devastation. The roads leading out of King's Landing were choked with people who had lost homes, families, livelihoods. Their eyes were hollow and they trudged like specters in a wasteland. Jon thought of offering them help or at least a comforting word, but he knew that revealing himself would be perilous. If word spread that Jon Snow, the man who killed the queen, was traveling the same roads, there would be blood. So he kept his head low, gave what he could, an apple here, a skin of water there, and pressed onward, his every step tinged with regret. As they journeyed north, rumors began to filter through the crowds. Some claimed Jon Snow had been executed by Grey Worm in a fit of vengeance. Others said Jon had fled on the back of Drogon, whisked away to some distant land. None of them recognized the quiet figure slipping through the camps at night, or if they did, they were too exhausted or frightened to care. Tormund's main concern was the possibility that any stray Unsullied or Dothraki outriders might come searching. But it seemed the bulk of Daenerys' army was too busy securing King's Landing and likely fighting among themselves for direction after her death to launch a large-scale pursuit. Day by day, Jon felt the air grow cooler, the sky more open. The rolling green hills gave way to rocky terrain, the farmland of the Reach turning to the starker fields of the Riverlands. At night, while Tormund snored softly, Jon would sit alone, staring into the flicker of their small campfire. Shadows danced across his features, and in that wavering light he wrestled with a swirl of memories. He saw Daenerys in the dim, narrow chambers of Dragonstone, gazing at him with a mixture of awe and wariness. He remembered her cry of triumph, the blaze of dragonfire, the moment the bells rang in King's Landing. He relived the blade sliding between her ribs, the way her eyes had locked onto his in a flash of betrayal, heartbreak, and the faintest glimmer of understanding. Did she hate him in that final moment, or did she see the necessity? He wondered if he would ever know. A few days later, they came upon a small band of northern soldiers on a forest path near the inn at the crossroads. Jon's heart lurched, half fearing it was his sister Sansa's men sent to arrest him. But the men, too worn and wary, only gave him a brief glance before turning away. They recognized Tormund, though, and some gave him respectful nods. One of them, a lanky spearman with a fresh scar slashed across his jaw, asked Tormund what had happened in King's Landing. Tormund shrugged and said, "Much death, less victory than we hoped," and left it at that. The spearman nodded grimly as though that was all he needed to hear. In times like these, men had little interest in details, survival overshadowed everything else. Jon kept his head lowered, not ready to answer their unspoken questions. Even so, the encounter left Jon shaken. He realized how precarious his position was. If these men had recognized him, the news would travel swiftly to Winterfell, and Sansa might be forced to condemn him or at least hold him accountable for killing the Dragon Queen. Yet, part of him yearned to see his family once more, if only for a final goodbye before slipping away into the wilderness beyond the wall. Conflicted as he was, he recognized that Sansa's interests would be best served by not having him around to stir up controversy. She would try to protect him, of that he had no doubt, but it might cost her everything she'd worked so hard to save. The next week was spent weaving northward through fields and forests, at times cutting across less-traveled routes to avoid large gatherings of people. Slowly, the muddy paths gave way to stony roads and the temperatures dropped even further. They were drawing near to the north, and despite everything, Jon felt a stirring of familiarity and relief. The crisp air, the dense pine forests, the quiet hush of the wind, these were home in a way King's Landing had never been. Tormund took note of it, grinning at the subtle shift in Jon's demeanor. "You feel that, don't you?" he said one evening as they made camp under the canopy of trees. "The north calling." Jon managed a half-smile. "Aye, but it's calling me to the wall. Winterfell will only be a stop on the way." Tormund nodded. "As you wish, Crow." He still called him Crow, sometimes a remnant of the banter they'd once shared at the wall. "We'll gather your things, see who's left of your family and friends, then be on our way." There was no judgment in his tone, just understanding. Tormund, too, was leaving something behind. He'd once told Jon that he'd had a giantess mother, that he was born for the cold and wildness of the far north. Civilized walls and lords weren't for him. So they continued their trek, forging a silent bond of companionship amid the hush of northern forests and the distant howling of wolves. The closer they got to Winterfell, the more Jon's tension grew. Memories assaulted him, his childhood as the bastard son of Eddard Stark, training with Robb in the courtyard, scrubbing armor, feeding the hounds, scraping ice from the ramparts in winter. He remembered Ygritte and the first time he had seen the wildling camps beyond the wall, her hair the color of kissed by fire, her laughter echoing in the hollows of a cave. And now, in a mad swirl of destiny, he was returning to the only other place that had ever felt like home, with the intention of leaving it behind again. When at last they reached the outskirts of Winterfell, the sky was a steely gray, the sun hidden by thick clouds that promised snow. Tormund looked about with a grin. "Feels more like home," he declared, sniffing the air. Jon pulled his cloak tighter, glancing over the ancient walls. The fortress had been rebuilt after Ramsay Bolton's destruction, its gray towers and battlements standing strong once more. Smoke drifted from the chimneys, a sign that people inside were busy preparing for the ever-present cold. Jon wondered what Sansa would say to him, how Arya would look at him, whether Bran's gaze would be as distant as ever, if Bran was even here at all. They approached on foot. Jon insisted on foregoing ceremony or announcement, wanting to slip into Winterfell quietly. But word traveled fast in this land. By the time they neared the gates, a handful of guards already stood waiting. Tormund placed his broad hand on the hilt of his sword, ready for trouble, but Jon lifted a hand to show no ill intent. One of the guards recognized Tormund and gave Jon a long, searching look. "Is that?" he started, but Tormund cut him off. "Yes, it is," he said, as if daring the guard to say otherwise. The guard glanced at Jon's face, uncertain. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he opened the gate. "Lady Stark should be informed," he murmured, stepping aside. Inside the courtyard, the bustle of daily life slowed as people noticed the newcomers. Blacksmiths paused at their anvils, stable boys peered out from stalls, and a couple of scullery maids held baskets of washing against their hips, eyes wide. Jon pulled back his hood. The hush that fell was thick with disbelief and a flicker of awe. For these northerners, Jon Snow had lived multiple legends. The bastard who became Lord Commander, who died and rose again, who fought the Night King and stood alongside Daenerys Targaryen. And now here he was, returned in the aftermath of the Dragon Queen's death and the city's ruin. Muttered whispers spread, but no one approached too closely. Soon enough, the heavy doors leading to the great hall opened and Sansa Stark appeared, flanked by a few wary guards. She wore a modest but finely made dress trimmed in fur, her hair braided in an elegant northern style. Despite her calm demeanor, Jon could see the swirl of emotions behind her eyes: surprise, wariness, relief, and concern. She descended the steps slowly. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. When she reached Jon, she studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke in a quiet voice that cut the chilly air like a blade. "Jon, I heard rumors." A pause. "I'm glad you're alive." Jon inclined his head in a stiff bow. He wanted to embrace her, to say something comforting. But the memory of Daenerys's blood on his hands kept him rooted in place. "Sansa," he managed, voice low. He glanced around, mindful of the many ears listening. "I need to speak with you, alone. Please." She nodded, gestured for him and Tormund to follow her inside. Servants and guards parted as they walked, letting them pass through the vaulted corridors until they reached a smaller chamber, one once used for private family gatherings. She dismissed the guards, leaving just Tormund, Jon, and herself. A fire crackled in the hearth, chasing away some of the cold. Sansa turned to face Jon, folding her hands before her. "Tell me everything." Jon looked into her cool, intelligent eyes. He had always respected Sansa, and he had come to trust her with the kingdom's well-being. He also knew she would not shy away from hard truths. So he told her the story of Daenerys' conquest, the battle with the Lannisters, the destruction of King's Landing, and his final decision to end Daenerys' life before she could cause more carnage. He spoke quietly but candidly, omitting no detail. Sansa's expression remained composed, though Jon could see her eyes flicker with horror and grief at the mention of thousands burned, the madness that had consumed Daenerys. When he finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last, Sansa spoke. "You did what you thought was right," she said, her voice carefully measured. "You always have. But you know the realm will see this in many ways. Some will curse your name as a traitor, others will praise you as a savior. There will be chaos." Jon nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. "I know. That's why I've come to say goodbye. I can't remain here, not when half the realm might call for my head or see me as a threat to any new king or queen that might rise." He glanced at Tormund, who listened in silence. "I'm going beyond the wall." Sansa stared at him, her lips parted in surprise. A flicker of heartbreak showed in her eyes, but she quickly mastered herself. "You only just came home and now you want to leave again?" she asked, a tremor in her voice. "What about family, your place here, everything we fought for?" Jon closed his eyes for a moment. "I'm not the rightful king in the north, Sansa. You were Lady of Winterfell, and the north deserves better than a man who can't escape the ghosts of his past. I have too many enemies in the south. My staying would only endanger you, Arya, and all we've built. I've seen enough blood." Sansa's gaze dropped to the floor. She breathed in deeply, struggling with a torrent of emotions. Then she lifted her head, expression resolute. "If you believe this is what must be done, then I won't stand in your way. But promise me you won't vanish without a word. I don't want to lose you again, Jon." Something in Jon's chest tightened, an ache that he suspected would never fully go away. "I promise," he said softly. Without further words, Sansa stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace. For a moment, the tension drained from his body, and he allowed himself to feel the warmth of his sister's love. Tormund looked away, respectfully giving them the moment. When they parted, Sansa addressed Tormund. "You'll watch over him, won't you?" Tormund, with a surprising gentleness, nodded. "He's like a lost pup. Someone's got to keep him out of trouble." He winked, trying to ease the sadness in the room, though no one laughed. They arranged for a discreet departure. Sansa insisted on giving them fresh horses, warm cloaks, and ample provisions. They would ride to Castle Black, which now served a skeleton crew for the Night's Watch. Though the world had changed, there were still occasional threats, bandits, rogue whites that had never quite been destroyed, and rumors of distant creatures. Even if the Watch was more symbolic than before, it remained a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. Jon spent a single night in Winterfell. He avoided the G. Reed Hall and any grand reunions. Word did spread that he had returned, and a few of the old guard who remembered him came to pay quiet respects in the courtyard. Arya was absent. She had left months ago, traveling west of Westeros to chase her own dreams of adventure. Bran was said to be in King's Landing or even further south, an enigmatic figure rumored to be shaping the future of the realm. Jon regretted not seeing them, but he knew it was better this way. The fewer people who saw him, the less complicated it would become. He had chosen his path. At dawn, Sansa stood at the gates to bid him farewell. She placed a hand on his cheek, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The North remembers," she said in a voice thick with emotion, "and it remembers you, Jon Snow." She paused, and then, more softly, "No matter what the songs say, you are always my brother." Jon squeezed her hand gently, words failing him. Then he and Tormund mounted their horses and set out, the sound of hooves on frost-laced earth marking their departure. Winterfell's walls receded behind them, and once more, Jon felt that strange mixture of loss and determination swirling within him. Tormund rode beside him, and neither spoke for a time. The road north was stark and quiet, lined by ancient trees and flurries of snow. Jon found a kind of solace in the cold wind that lashed his face, as though nature itself welcomed him back to the harsh lands he belonged in. They reached Castle Black after several days of travel, during which snowstorms slowed their progress. The old fortress loomed, its black stone walls stained gray by time, its towers battered by countless winters. Fewer men walked the battlements now, and the gates looked in dire need of repair. Yet it stood, a testament to centuries of vigilance against threats from the far north. Jon felt a pang of nostalgia as they rode through the gatehouse. He had once been Lord Commander here, had once tried to unite the Watch and the wildlings against the Night King. He remembered the haunting chants in the sept, the clang of training swords, and the perpetual cold that seeped into the bones. A pair of watchmen greeted them, uncertain but respectful. They recognized Tormund. His reputation for forging peace between wildlings and the Night's Watch was well known. Jon kept his hood up, though it soon became unnecessary. As he dismounted, the watchmen's faces lit with recognition, and one gasped out, "Lord Commander Snow?" He reached out as though seeing a ghost. Jon lowered his gaze. "I'm no Lord Commander," he murmured. "Not anymore." Nevertheless, word spread quickly through the small garrison, and soon a few others came forward to greet them. Most of them were young recruits who had grown up hearing stories of Jon Snow's legendary deeds. They asked about the dragons, the Night King, the fate of Daenerys Targaryen. Jon responded only with curt answers. He had no interest in rewriting history or justifying his actions. He was here to pass through, to ensure that the path beyond the wall was secure, and then vanish into the wild. That very evening, he made inquiries about the state of the land beyond the wall. One of the older Night's Watch veterans who had served under Jon's command in another life informed him that scattered tribes of free folk were slowly reclaiming their ancestral territories. The forest had begun to replenish. The endless night of the White Walkers was a memory, though occasionally whispers of unnatural occurrences filtered through. Strange lights in the sky, movements in the deep snow. Nothing confirmed, but enough to keep the watchful men uneasy. "With winter always threatening, we're never safe," the old veteran remarked. "But it's better than it was." Jon and Tormund agreed they would leave at first light. That evening, as the wind howled around the towers, Jon walked the familiar corridors alone. He passed the mess hall where he had shared meals with Sam, Gren, and PYP. He stood for a long time outside the door to the Lord Commander's quarters, memories stirring inside him like restless ghosts. Once he had been burdened by leadership, forced to make impossible decisions. Now he had abdicated all those responsibilities, yet he felt no relief, only a dull ache. He wondered if a man could ever truly be free of responsibility, or if it latched onto the soul like a direwolf's jaws, never letting go. Dawn came cold and clear. After a brief exchange of farewells with the black-clad brothers, Jon and Tormund led their horses past the massive ice gate in the wall, into the wild expanse beyond. The wall stood as imposing as ever, its great height casting a long shadow. But Jon felt a sense of finality as they passed through it, as though stepping off a great stage where his part had ended. The men of the Watch would remain, standing guard. He wished them well, but knew he belonged in the uncharted reaches on the other side. The land beyond the wall was a stark white canvas. Snow blanketed the ground, the trees, the very air as flakes drifted lazily downward. It was both beautiful and forbidding, reminding Jon of the many nights he had spent huddled in makeshift shelters or riding with the wildlings through blizzards. He remembered Ygritte's laughter in these very forests, her fearless spirit as they faced white attacks and the constant threat of the Night's Watch. Now, that chapter was an echo from another life. Yet here he was again, an outsider crossing the threshold. Tormund led the way. He knew the terrain, the hidden paths, and the best spots to set up camp. It would be a long journey to the Free Folk's main camp, but Tormund assured Jon that they'd find friendly faces who would welcome the famed King Crow among them. As they pressed deeper into the wilderness, the sense of emptiness and solitude grew, but so did Jon's awareness of the rugged beauty around him. Towering pines rose like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. Here and there, the sun's rays pierced the canopy, sending shimmering motes of light dancing across the frigid air. They camped under a rocky overhang their first night, building a small fire sheltered from the wind. Over a modest meal of dried meat and hard bread, Tormund stared at Jon from across the flames. "You look more at peace here," the wildling said, his voice echoing softly in the sheltered space. Jon poked at the fire, the embers glowing against the cold darkness. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "Everything that's happened, the wars, the politics, the betrayals, it all feels so far away now. Out here, it's just survival and the people you trust by your side." A pause. "Maybe this is the life I was meant for." Tormund gave a great snort. "Of course it is. You were never one for fancy titles. You'll do well here, Jon Snow." Jon's gaze flickered to the dancing flames. He said nothing more, only let the silence linger between them. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, its call echoing through the cold night air. Jon remembered Ghost and felt a pang of longing. But Tormund had said Ghost was up here somewhere, roaming with the free folk. The thought gave Jon a small spark of hope. The following days tested their endurance. Snowstorms came and went with a ferocity that reminded Jon of the punishing climates he had experienced when first ranging beyond the wall. At times, the wind whipped so fiercely that communication became impossible, reduced to gestures and shared looks of determination. They forded half-frozen streams, broke camp early to cover more ground, and took turns keeping watch at night while the others slept fitfully. Tormund maintained his usual good humor, complaining jovially about the lack of proper ale or the absence of a good woman to warm his bed. Jon found it strangely reassuring. Life might be cold and brutal here, but friendship was a constant flame. On the 6th day beyond the wall, they crested a ridge that overlooked a vast, snowbound valley. In the distance, the faint glow of fires could be seen. Tormund pointed, grinning widely. "They're up there. The free folk. They're spread out, but that's one of the main camps. You'll see." Encouraged by the sight of potential shelter, they urged their weary horses forward. By dusk, they reached the outskirts of a scattering of hide tents and wooden huts. Figures wrapped in furs emerged to see who approached, weapons in hand and suspicion on their breath. When Tormund dismounted, letting out a hearty laugh, the tension dissolved. Some recognized him immediately and rushed forward with exclamations of relief and welcome. Jon slid off his horse, shoulders hunched against the cold, mindful of the curious stares. He heard whispers, "Is that him? Jon Snow?" The croaking. But Tormund's presence and boisterous greetings eased the unease. Soon, a small crowd gathered, offering them a place to warm themselves. The largest of the huts was set aside for communal meetings, and there they lit a roaring fire. Settling in, Jon felt the warmth seep into his bones. The free folk examined him with unabashed curiosity, some remembering him from the wars against the White Walkers, others hearing tales of the man who had brokered peace with the Night's Watch. Among them was a tall wildling woman with braided hair the color of burnished copper. She eyed Jon appraisingly. "We heard you killed the Dragon Queen," she said bluntly. A hush fell around the fire, all eyes turning to Jon. Tormund cut in quickly, "We're not here to talk about that. Jon Snow's come home to the true north. That's all you need to know." The woman shrugged, seemingly satisfied. Wildlings cared little for the politics of the South so long as it didn't threaten their way of life. Jon cleared his throat, taking a small cup of broth offered by a child. "Thank you," he said softly. The child looked at him in awe, then scampered away. The tension in the hut eased, replaced by a mild acceptance that this was indeed the fabled Jon Snow returned at Tormund's side. They spoke little that night of the events in King's Landing. Instead, talk drifted to the state of the land, the best hunting grounds, and the strange occurrences some folks swore they had witnessed in the far north, glimpses of giant ice spiders, lights in the sky that danced like ribbons. Jon listened, content to remain quiet, absorbing the stories. He felt that intangible sense of belonging creeping back, the primal bond forged in shared hardship. In the days that followed, Jon and Tormund settled into the rhythms of free folk life. They helped repair huts, gather firewood, and hunt game for the communal meals. Jon found a strange solace in the simplicity of these tasks. No one asked him to rule. No one demanded that he make grand decisions. Here, he was just another pair of hands, another survivor in a land of brutal beauty. Sometimes, around the flickering fires at night, he would be drawn into conversation about the White Walker War, about the battles they had fought together. Men and women recounted their memories, weaving them into legends that felt both distant and raw. Jon added little to these retellings, content to let others narrate the grand stories. If asked directly, he would speak in his quiet, measured way, but he never sought the spotlight. One morning, while checking the snares along a stretch of forest, Jon heard a low growl behind him. He turned slowly, hand moving toward the hilt of his sword. Emerging from the trees was Ghost, his white fur blending almost perfectly with the snow. The dire wolf approached, his crimson eyes fixed on Jon in an expression that seemed part curiosity, part recognition. Jon's heart soared. He sank to one knee, letting the wolf come to him. Ghost sniffed at Jon's outstretched hand, then pushed his muzzle against Jon's chest, a silent affirmation of their bond. Jon buried his fingers in Ghost's thick fur, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I've missed you," he whispered, swallowing the emotion that threatened to spill. In that moment, any lingering sense of displacement vanished. He was where he belonged, at least for now. The sight of Ghost by Jon's side caused excitement in the camp. Some of the children giggled and ran circles around the dire wolf, while the elders nodded in approval as if seeing a piece of old magic return. Tormund grinned broadly when he saw them together, giving Jon a hearty clap on the back. "Now it's a proper reunion," he said, and Jon couldn't help a small smile in return. As time passed, Jon found himself adapting more fully to life among the free folk. He built friendships with those who had been mere acquaintances before. He helped with scouting missions further north, ensuring there were no white remnants lurking in hidden valleys. Now and then, travelers from other wildling clans arrived, bringing news and exchanging goods. They referred to Jon as the man who had united them against the dead, who had saved them from the Night King. Some regarded him as a kind of folk hero, while others eyed him with caution, uncertain how a former crow fit among them. Tormund never hesitated to boast of Jon's deeds, though Jon himself remained reserved, focusing on the tasks at hand. During the nights, beside crackling fires, Jon wrestled with the memory of Daenerys and King's Landing. He would see the city in flames when he closed his eyes, hear the cries of the dying. He would feel the dagger in his hand, the way her body had gone slack in his arms. These memories weighed on him like lead, but here, under the northern skies, he found room to breathe. There were no keep walls to confine him, no lords or ladies to judge him. Here, he found space to begin the slow, uncertain process of healing. Still, a part of him wondered if the realm had fallen into chaos after Daenerys' death. Would Tyrion shape a new form of governance? Would Sansa have to fend off challengers from the south, or would Arya return from her travels? These questions lurked in the recesses of his mind, but he forced them away. If the realm truly needed him, somehow news would reach him, but he doubted that day would come. He was not the Targaryen heir, nor was he a lord or king. He was simply Jon Snow, a man who had done what he believed right, for better or worse. One afternoon, as winter's sun cast long shadows across the snow, Tormund approached Jon outside one of the newly built huts. Ghost lay curled in the snow at Jon's feet, muzzle resting on his forepaws. Tormund folded his arms across his broad chest. "You've been quiet these last few days," he said, voice tinged with concern. Jon shrugged, glancing at the horizon. "Just thinking," he said. He frowned slightly. "I keep waiting for something. Maybe retribution. A raven from the south. Or soldiers knocking at my door. I killed their queen, Tormund. Even if many hated her for what she did, some must still hunger for vengeance." Tormund nodded, considering Jon's words. "Maybe. But who's going to come this far north for vengeance? The new rulers in the south would be fools to send an army here where the land itself would fight them. And if some try, they'll find we're not as helpless as we used to be." He looked around at the wildlings moving about camp. "They respect you, Jon. You saved them once. They'd stand with you if trouble came." Jon managed a small smile. He placed a hand on Ghost's head. "I never wanted the kind of loyalty," he said softly. "But I'm grateful for it." Tormund clapped him on the shoulder. "You don't get to choose it, Crow. We follow the strong and the just. And you're strong even if you don't believe it." With that, Tormund walked away, leaving Jon to his thoughts. That night, a feast of sorts took place in the camp. Wild boar had been hunted successfully, and the people gathered around large fires to roast the meat. Mead was passed around in horn cups, laughter filling the frigid air. For a time, the harshness of the environment was forgotten in the warmth of camaraderie. Jon sat among them, Ghost at his side, occasionally accepting a cup of mead. Despite the festivity, he remained largely silent, content to watch the free folk revel in their hard-won freedom. Tormund joined in the dancing, spinning around the fire with a laughing woman, the two of them bellowing a ribald song. Jon felt a pang of envy, remembering a time when he could have let go that way. But that was a lifetime ago. Later, after the revelers had begun to drift off to their shelters, Jon stayed by the dying embers of the main fire. The stars twinkled overhead in a sky so clear it felt as though he could reach up and pluck them like fruit. Ghost settled down beside him, providing silent company. The night was still, save for the faint crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of wind through the pines. Jon let the quiet sink into his bones, a welcome antidote to the endless noise of war and politics that had once been his life. He reflected on the path that had brought him here, the secrets of his parentage revealed by Sam and Bran, the bond he had shared with Daenerys, the Whites and White Walkers, the betrayal at Castle Black, and the heartbreak after heartbreak that had defined his journey. It struck him that despite all of it, despite death and resurrection, war and betrayal, he had somehow found a measure of peace. Perhaps the peace was tentative and perhaps it would be tested. But it was more than he'd had in ages. The North's cold might freeze men's bones, but the clarity of this land offered a chance to live authentically, free from the burdens of crowns and thrones. As the weeks turned into months, Jon's days fell into a steady routine. He went on hunting expeditions, bringing back meat for the encampment. He and Tormund led scouting parties to check for any sign of lingering undead or bandits. Occasionally, small groups of wildlings arrived from more remote areas, forging new alliances, sharing news of distant frontiers. Some said there were pockets of land further north untouched by the White Walker invasion, teeming with game. Others told of new dangers, massive beasts awakened from the deep, though these accounts were often accompanied by mead-fueled exaggeration. Through it all, Jon remained steadfast, offering his sword and his wisdom when needed, but never claiming leadership. The free folk had their chieftains and elders. He was content to be a shield for them if required. One crisp morning, Tormund approached Jon with news. Some of the clans are pushing even further north, beyond the Frostfangs, he said. They want to settle lands that have been abandoned for generations. Good soil there, they say, and plenty of game. He eyed Jon speculatively. They've asked if you'd come along. Having the man who fought the dead on their side is a strong guarantee, they think. Jon exhaled, breath fogging in the chilly air. The idea of venturing even deeper into the unknown tugged at him. There was a restless energy in him that recognized this was the natural course. I'll go, he said simply. Tormund's face split into a grin. I thought you would. I told them as much. We'll gather a few supplies here, then set off in a week's time. That decision marked a new chapter in Jon's life beyond the wall. He spent the following days preparing. He helped the wildlings who would remain in the current settlement, making sure they had fortifications, stored supplies, and a means of communicating with the watchers on the wall if danger arose. As he busied himself, he couldn't help but feel a surge of purpose. He was forging a new future, not for kings or lords, but for the free folk who had faced extinction and now had a chance at life again. It felt right. On the appointed day, a small caravan of wildlings, including families, hunters, and a few elders, assembled on the outskirts of camp. Sleighs laden with furs, food, and tents stood ready. Children clung to their mothers, gazing up at Jon with wide eyes. Ghosts prowled among them, unbothered by the noise and activity. Tormund directed the loading of supplies, barking orders with his typical flair. When everything was ready, Jon mounted a sturdy Garen, a horse bred for the cold. Tormund did the same, positioning himself at the front of the group. Off we go, then Tormund called out, his voice carrying over the assembled travelers. We'll carve ourselves a home in the heart of the true north. With that they set off, forging a trail through the deep snow. The journey was arduous, fraught with hidden crevices and sudden storms, but the wildlings were accustomed to such hardships. They moved in a loose formation, with scouts fanning out to check for safe passages. Over time, the landscape changed, becoming rockier, more jagged, as they ascended the foothills of the Frostfangs. Towering peaks loomed ahead, their slopes cloaked in ice and flurries of snow. But there was also a stark beauty to it all, a wild, untamed grandeur. Jon rode near Tormund most of the time, exchanging stories and plans. We'll find a good spot by a river, Tormund mused. Build huts, maybe even proper cabins if we can get the wood. The children will grow up thinking the war with the dead was just a story we tell by the fireside. Jon nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It's good they'll have that, he said. They deserve peace. Tormund eyed him thoughtfully. What about you, Jon Snow? Do you deserve peace? Jon shrugged, gazing at the horizon. I suppose if I keep working for it, maybe I'll earn a piece of it someday. Their caravan pressed on, day after day, forging deeper into the Frostfangs than Jon had ever been. The further they traveled, the more he realized how vast the land truly was, how little the Southerners knew of its expanse. One morning, they came upon a breathtaking sight, a frozen waterfall cascading down a cliffside, the ice sparkling in the pale sunlight like a crystal tapestry. The children marveled at it, laughing and sliding around on the slick surface at the edges. Jon found himself smiling at their delight. In moments like these, he caught glimpses of the life he had yearned for, unburdened, unchained from prophecies and expectations. Eventually, they found the river Tormund had mentioned, a wide, sluggish thing half-covered with ice, winding through a vale sheltered by pine-laden hills. Here, the wind was somewhat gentler and the trees provided ample building material. After much discussion, the free folk decided the spot would make a suitable new settlement. They named it Stonewater Vale, a simple name that captured the rugged and frigid terrain, and began the process of clearing ground for tents and huts. Jon dove into the work, using his sword to chop through ice-crusted shrubs, hauling logs, helping construct the basic frames of shelters. With every swing of the axe, every hole dug for support posts, he felt a sense of tangible accomplishment, far more satisfying than 1,000 political negotiations in the South. Tormund organized hunting parties to bring back fresh meat. Ghost often accompanied them, prowling silently through the forests in search of prey. The children learned to snare small animals for food, while the elders taught them how to skin hides and cure meat. At night, they gathered around fires, telling stories and sharing laughter that resonated in the crisp night air. In this environment, Jon found acceptance that didn't hinge on the Targaryen name or the Stark legacy. He was one of them, a man shaped by the ice and snow who had fought alongside them to defend all life from darkness. As the settlement grew, so did Jon's sense of calm. The haunting dreams of King's Landing began to recede, though they never vanished entirely. He often thought of Daenerys, not with bitterness, but with a melancholic longing for what might have been had she chosen mercy over conquest. He thought of her fierce spirit, her idealism, and how it had turned into a destructive rage. Some nights he would whisper a soft prayer to the old gods, hoping they might grant her peace wherever her spirit roamed. Time flowed differently here. Weeks bled into months, and the settlement thrived. More free folk arrived, drawn by the promise of a new beginning. Though scarce, game was plentiful enough to sustain them, and they learned to preserve meat for the harsher parts of the winter. Jon took part in every aspect of their life, hunting, building, teaching the children basic sword skills so they could defend themselves if needed. His hair grew longer, his beard thicker, and the worry lines etched on his face began to soften. The threat of external forces loomed occasionally in conversation, another wave of the dead or some southern lord launching a punitive expedition. But those were far-off concerns overshadowed by the day-to-day tasks of living. There were huts to build, wood to chop, and a community to nurture. Jon thrived in this environment of necessity. Here, no one spoke of prophecies or insisted on kneeling. Here, the measure of a man was found in his willingness to share the work, the dangers, and the rewards. In the evenings, he sometimes found himself sitting on a rocky outcrop overlooking the settlement, watching as torchlight dotted the cluster of huts below. Ghost would be at his side, ears perked, eyes scanning the darkness for threats. In those quiet moments, Jon felt the stirring of something he had never truly known before: contentment. The memory of Daenerys' death and the horrors of the last war still pricked at the corners of his mind, but they no longer consumed him. His nights were mostly free of nightmares, replaced by dreams of hunting through snowy forests or sharing a simple meal with friends. Some nights he conversed with Tormund about the future. "How long before the next king in the south tries to come after us, you think?" Tormund would ask, halfway joking. Jon would shake his head, a wry twist to his lips. "Maybe never. Let's hope never. We have nothing they want up here, unless they fancy freezing to death." Tormund would laugh heartily, raising a cup to that sentiment. Neither of them could be sure the South would leave them in peace forever, but for now, they seized each day as it came. On one particularly clear night, the northern lights danced across the sky, shimmering curtains of green, pink, and blue that rippled in silent majesty. The entire settlement gazed upward in awe, children pointing and gasping with delight. Jon watched the celestial display, reminded of how small and fleeting mortal concerns were compared to the vast theater of the cosmos. In that moment, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the second chance he had been given, for the friends by his side, for the simple truth that he was still alive to witness beauty in a world once threatened by eternal darkness. As winter deepened, the settlement braced for harsher conditions. Blizzards howled through the valleys, forcing everyone to huddle in their huts for days at a time. Yet, within the huts, people gathered around fires to share stories, keep spirits high, and maintain a sense of community. Jon found these moments strangely comforting. The closeness, the vulnerability, and the collective will to survive. It reminded him that life's best qualities could be found in unity, not in conquest or tyranny. During one such storm, as the wind battered the roof and walls of the communal hall, Tormund initiated a conversation that stirred a new possibility in Jon's mind. "You know," Tormund said, poking at the fire, "we're building something real here. Once the storm passes, we'll scout further into the mountains, see if we can find a better pass for trade or maybe a safer route for those who still want to join us. You should come. The free folk trust you. Maybe you can help unite more clans." Jon stared into the flames, considering the offer. "Unite more clans," he echoed. "Last time I tried uniting people, it ended in fire and blood." Tormund snorted. "That was different. That was about lords and queens and those damned iron chairs. This is about survival. You brought the free folk through the wall once, and we fought the dead together. This time, it's just living folks who need a place to call home." Jon nodded slowly, feeling that familiar sense of responsibility tug at him. It wasn't the burdensome weight of a crown. It was a chance to do genuine good for people who relied on him. "All right," he agreed quietly. "When the storm passes, we'll see what can be done." With that, the conversation turned to lighter topics, but Jon felt a stir of resolution forming within him. He was no king, but he knew how to bring people together under a common cause. If the free folk needed that, he would provide it. It felt almost like atonement. He had taken a life, Daenerys's, to save the realm. Now, perhaps he could devote his life to ensuring that ordinary people could live in peace, far from the manipulations of power-hungry lords. When the storm finally subsided, Jon, Tormund, and a small band of hunters set off to explore deeper into the Frostfangs. They left Stonewater Vale at first light, carrying only essential supplies and trusting in their survival skills. The air was crisp and the snow pristine. The expedition was both exhilarating and treacherous. They navigated narrow passes, skirted ice-choked rivers, and climbed ridges that offered awe-inspiring vistas of a boundless, icy wilderness. The higher they went, the rarer the air felt, and the more each breath became a conscious effort. Yet, the camaraderie among the group made the journey feel less daunting. Tormund's jokes, the hunters' banter, and Jon's silent resolve blended into a sense of solidarity that warmed them against the cold. On the third day of their exploration, they stumbled upon another gathering of free folk, smaller, ragged, and more desperate. They had settled in a ravine, their tents battered by the harsh wind. Many looked malnourished, their eyes full of anxiety. When Tormund's group arrived, they raised their weapons, uncertain if they faced enemies or friends. But Tormund's presence and Jon's calm demeanor soon defused the tension. Conversation revealed that this clan had been struggling to find game and had lost many of their strongest hunters to the winter's cruelty. Some were on the brink of starvation. Without hesitation, Jon and Tormund offered them what spare rations they had. Then they helped them pack up camp and guided them back toward Stonewater Vale, where they could find shelter and resources. Though the journey back was grueling, the gratitude of these rescued free folk lent a new sense of purpose to the effort. Jon carried a child on his back for miles, the boy too weak to walk. Tormund hefted sacks of meager belongings with ease, cracking jokes to keep spirits afloat. The rescued clan's elders expressed astonishment that the great Jon Snow was the one hauling their goods rather than lording over them. Jon only smiled ruefully. "I'm no lord," he said. "Not anymore if I ever was." When they finally reached Stonewater Vale, the new arrivals were greeted with relief and hospitality. People quickly gathered blankets, hot broth, and any resources they could spare. The huts might be cramped, but they were warmer than a wind-blown ravine in the mountains. Jon and Tormund spent hours organizing space, distributing supplies, and reassuring the frightened. By nightfall, the rescued free folk were settled around fires, their hunger and exhaustion giving way to cautious hope. Once again, Jon felt that sense of quiet fulfillment. He had always believed in protecting the vulnerable. Now, he was doing it on a small scale without the fanfare of banners or the complexity of royal courts. In this, he found a clarity that had long eluded him in the realm of lords and ladies. As the settlement's population grew, so did the sense of community. Jon found himself at the heart of it not by choice, but by the trust people placed in him. They sought his counsel on where to hunt, how to guard against threats, how to resolve disputes. Even Tormund, never one for formality, occasionally deferred to Jon in matters of strategy. Jon tried to keep things decentralized, encouraging the free folk to make their own decisions whenever possible. Yet, inevitably many still looked to him as a guiding force. One chilly evening, after settling a minor dispute between two hunters over a shared kill, Jon took a moment to reflect by the riverside. The water, partially frozen, gleamed under a pale moon. Ghost padded up beside him, nose snuffling in the frosty air. Jon placed a hand on the direwolf's thick fur, allowing his thoughts to wander. This life he'd built here was worlds away from the Iron Throne, dragons, and the politics of the South. He had no illusions that it was perfect, winter was harsh, and survival demanded constant vigilance. But this was honest work, free from the shadow of crowns and prophecy. He bowed his head, sending a silent prayer to the old gods, for the free folk, for the memory of those he had loved and lost, and for a future that might hold a measure of peace. In that moment, the cold wind carried with it the faint scent of pine and distant snow. Jon inhaled deeply, feeling the chill fill his lungs, and exhaled into the night, watching his breath disperse into the darkness. He closed his eyes, allowing the hush of the wild north to seep into his very core. He knew he would carry the burden of Daenerys' death forever, just as he carried the burden of having failed those who died in the wars. But here, beyond the wall, he was building something anew, brick by brick, hut by hut, life by life. He hoped it would honor the sacrifices made, including hers. Perhaps that was the best any man could do after so much pain, to keep living, to help others live, and to let the unrelenting winter wind carry away the echoes of regret. A soft crunch of snow pulled him from his thoughts. Tormund approached, his breath puffing in the moonlight. "You all right, Crow?" he asked, voice gentle despite his gruff demeanor. Jon nodded. "Aye," he said quietly, looking up at the sky, at the swirling tapestry of stars. "For the first time in a long while. I think I might be." Tormund clapped him on the shoulder, and together, with Ghost following, they walked back to the settlement where the fires burned bright against the night. And in the stillness of the true north, Jon Snow continued to walk forward, step by step, into a future that, while uncertain, held the promise of belonging and purpose. Here, far from the doomed throne of swords and the ashes of a queen's ambition, he would seek a life unburdened by crowns, guided only by the compass of his own heart and the unbreakable bond of loyalty to the free folk he called his own. Jon rose early the next morning, a thin sheen of frost dusting his beard and eyelashes. The settlement in Stonewater Vale stirred slowly to life all around him, men and women unwrapping themselves from thick fur cloaks, tents trembling under the pull of the winter wind, and children peeking out to see if the day promised mild weather or another punishing storm. Smoke drifted upward from the communal fires, where a handful of dedicated souls sought to maintain a steady glow through the night. Ghost had spent the dark hours curled near Jon's tent, his large body shielding the cold from creeping inside. Now the dire wolf stood upright, shaking loose any clinging snow, and padded after Jon as he made his way toward the settlement's center. He found Tormund already there, shouting jovially with a group of newly arrived wildlings. The big man caught Jon's eye, waving a meaty hand in greeting. The group around Tormund had evidently spent part of the night traveling, judged by their exhausted looks and the layers of grime on their furs. A few among them nodded to Jon in recognition. News traveled fast, and the name Jon Snow was etched into the living tapestry of wildling stories. A couple of children stared at Ghost's red eyes and white fur, whispering to each other in awe. Tormund clapped one man on the back, then lumbered over to Jon, a grin lighting up his ruddy face. "Look who's decided to join us," he boomed. "Refugees from deep in the mountains. They got wind of how Stonewater Vale's growing. Had some trouble with snow bears near their old camp. We've got to find them a good spot for their tents." Jon studied the new arrivals, noting their wary posture and the gaunt cheeks of some. Life this far north demanded resilience, but everyone reached a breaking point if winter's fury pushed too hard. "We can set them up on that slope above the river," Jon said, keeping his voice low so as not to jolt the wary travelers with abrupt orders. "It's sheltered from the worst winds. We just need to cut a path through the trees, maybe shore up the ground with logs so the snowmelt doesn't flood their camp." Tormund nodded, his grin replaced by a look of determination. "Sounds about right. Let's get on it once the sun rises a bit higher. No need to freeze our cocks off in this half-light." He glanced around, then dropped his voice. "How you holding up, Crow?" Jon shrugged. "Fine as I can be. It's been quiet so far. No sign of trouble." At that, Tormund gave a hearty chuckle. "Always the watchful one. It'll do us good. You'll see." They spent the morning organizing the newcomers, portioning out spare tents and furs to those who'd arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs. As with so many of the scattered free folk, these recent arrivals carried tales of hardship, raids from snow bears grown bold by hunger, or sudden storms that had leveled their crude shelters. Yet, as Jon listened to their stories, a flicker of hope always emerged, woven into the telling like a slender thread of gold through coarse cloth. They came here because they'd heard that Stonewater Vale was safe, that it was a place where no one lorded power over them, where communal fires never went cold if anyone could help it. Jon didn't claim leadership, but more and more, people looked his way for direction. Sometimes he thought about gently discouraging them, reminding them he wasn't a king, had never wanted to be one, but the memory of Daenerys' final breath would seep into his mind, and he'd understand that, even if he was done with crowns and claims, he could still guide these people to something better. So he simply did what came naturally, offered them a practical solution, a reassuring nod, or a calm presence when disputes threatened to erupt. By midday, the newcomers had set up their tents at the riverside slope, with Tormund leading volunteers to clear brush and shape a few stout logs into a rudimentary retaining wall. Jon helped as well, swinging his axe to fell saplings and passing them along a loose chain of workers. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, keeping his muscles warm against the cold and his mind from drifting into darker memories. He paused only once, leaning on his axe to watch the swirl of camp life. Children playing a game of chase, older wildlings hauling loads of splitwood to be stacked, a young woman expertly gutting fish at the riverbank. Ghost prowled near her, nose twitching. The settlement breathed, not as a fortress or city, but as a living organism, forging its own traditions and rhythms in these wild lands. Though the sun lingered for only a handful of hours in the deep winter, that day felt long and full. When dusk finally arrived, the stragglers gathered around communal fires to share in a modest feast. Several hunters had returned with 2 caribou taken in pine forests, enough to distribute fresh meat. The newcomers were grateful for the meal, and many of them, through mouthfuls of steaming stew, told more detailed versions of how they escaped near starvation in the high mountain passes. Some had lost loved ones to the cold, while others had parted ways with clans that refused to move on. Life beyond the wall had always been harsh, but now, with the threat of White Walkers gone, at least the wildlings could decide their destinies without fear of undead armies. Jon listened quietly, occasionally adding a question or a word of sympathy. He could sense the flicker in their eyes when they recognized him, an unspoken awe for the man who'd once been Lord Commander and had fought alongside them at Harhome. In time, cups of ale, brewed from meager supplies of grain and sweetened with mountain berries, were passed around, loosening tongues and brightening cheeks. Tormund led a raucous round of laughter with one of his outrageous tales, complete with outspread arms and comedic grimaces. Jon caught himself smiling a few times despite his inclination toward somber reflection. For all the hardships, there was life and light here. When the night finally pressed in and people drifted to their huts and tents, Jon remained at the central fire. Its flames danced and hissed, the wood crackling in protest of the cold. Ghost lay curled at his feet, nose on paws, ears occasionally pricking at faint noises from the dark. Jon watched the embers shift, his thoughts drifting south for a moment, wondering how Sansa fared in Winterfell. Did Arya still wander the unknown seas? Was Bran truly king now, as Tyrion had once suggested might happen? No word had reached him of any new monarch's attempts to re-establish control over the north. That might be because the north was now its own kingdom under Sansa, or because no one in the Six Kingdoms had the will or resources to chase down rumors of Jon Snow's whereabouts. He remembered the day he'd plunged that dagger into Daenerys. The instant her breath caught, her eyes wide with betrayal, sorrow, and perhaps a flicker of relief, he couldn't be certain. The burden weighed on him still, though the wilderness gave him space to bear it more quietly. Duty had demanded the worst of him, and he'd carried it out. The gods, old or new, had not struck him down, though he sometimes felt he deserved their wrath. Instead, they'd given him the second chance, to live, to be of use in a realm far from the Iron Throne's shadow. He exhaled, rising from the ground and giving Ghost a soft pat. "Let's get some rest," he murmured. The direwolf blinked up at him, ears perked, and followed as Jon made his way toward the small hut he'd pieced together over the months, a structure of logs, mud, and thatched branches. Inside, it was hardly warm, but it was secure enough to block the worst of the wind. He lay down on his bedding of furs, exhaustion sapping any rebellious thoughts. With Ghost's presence near the door, Jon allowed himself to sink into the oblivion of sleep. Over the following weeks, Stonewater Vale continued to grow. Word of its relative security and the presence of both Tormund Giantsbane and Jon Snow spread quickly among the scattered free folk, drawing in more families. Some arrived carrying news of faint but disturbing sightings, shapes glimpsed at the edges of the northern darkness, tall as men but moving with an eerie silence. Rumors of ice spiders and other creatures that might have survived the fall of the White Walkers circulated in whispers around the fires. Jon felt his instincts prickle at these stories. Even if the Night King was gone, the far north was vast and filled with unknown dangers. Snow fell steadily, day by day, piling up around huts until pathways had to be dug. The settlement constructed a large communal longhouse with multiple fire pits to keep people warm when storms made individual tents precarious. At first, this demanded an extraordinary effort, felling trees, gathering stones for the foundation, layering ice and mud for insulation. Jon and Tormund worked alongside everyone else, guiding but never commanding, showing by example how to cut notches in logs so they fit together more securely. Occasionally, the wind whipped up so fiercely that workers had to drop everything and huddle behind rock outcrops. But each day they made progress. It was during the building of the longhouse that a small band of free folk scouts returned from a 2-week exploration into the northwestern reaches of the Frostfangs. They came back in the middle of a roaring blizzard, barely able to speak through chapped lips and half-frozen beards. Jon helped haul them into the half-finished longhouse where fires crackled beneath its still-open roof. While Tormund cursed and fussed over them, layering them with furs and pressing hot broth to their lips, Jon quietly asked about their journey. The oldest among the group, an angular woman with a scar down her left cheek, managed to speak first. Her voice rasped with dryness. We found a pass that led us to a valley. Looked untouched for centuries. Game tracks everywhere. But we also saw ruins, I think. Ruins of an old settlement. Not from our people, looked older, more like the first men's style, but half buried in ice. Jon felt a knot stirring in his chest. Ruins of the first men. He recalled old Nan's stories of the age of heroes, the ancient kingdoms in the north, the songs of the children of the forest. Did you see anyone there? he asked gently, trying not to overwhelm her. The woman shook her head. No living souls, if that's what you mean. But at night, we heard sounds. Echoes, maybe? Could have been the wind howling through the stone. She paused, eyes flickering with unease. Or something else. Tormund's brow furrowed. More likely just the wind. You know how the mountains are. Still, maybe we can send a bigger group once the weather breaks. If it's full of game, that could be worth exploring. Jon nodded, watching the scout's eyes. She looked spooked. Many in the far north were used to harsh conditions and eerie noises, but something about her gaze suggested she'd heard or seen something that unsettled her deeply. Nevertheless, she remained silent beyond that initial account, content to sip broth and warm her bones. Jon resolved to keep an open mind. The land still held secrets, remnants of older magic. If they had discovered an ancient settlement or fortress, perhaps it offered new possibilities and new dangers. After the storm subsided, the days turned marginally clearer, though the temperature remained so cold it burned skin if left uncovered for more than a few moments. Under these conditions, finishing the longhouse became a top priority. Carpenters among the wildlings, by necessity, many of them had learned to craft wood, designed a large wooden roof supported by sturdy beams. When at last it was done, the entire settlement breathed a sigh of relief. Now, instead of crouching in cramped tents or huts during storms, everyone could gather in the longhouse. Fires roared at intervals down its center, and the combined body heat of dozens of people made the air inside almost pleasant. One night, while the wind howled outside and the temperature plummeted, nearly the entire community squeezed into the longhouse. Men, women, and children huddled together in small circles around the fires, telling stories or simply dozing against each other's backs. The air was thick with smoke, but also with a sense of unity. Jon found a spot near the end of the hall, where Ghost could rest without being jostled by too many feet. Tormund joined him shortly, carrying 2 crude wooden cups of warmed ale. Nearly had to wrestle a man for the last of this batch, Tormund said, passing 1 cup to Jon with a lopsided grin. We need more supplies if we're to keep so many warm and fed. Good news is, more people means more hunters, gatherers, and hands for building. Jon took a sip. The ale was bitter, but it spread warmth through his chest. Aye, that's the balance. We'll need to scout out that valley you heard about or keep forging relationships with other free folk. Maybe some are better farmers or have a surplus of grain. Tormund barked a laugh. Farmers? In this cold? Maybe somewhere in the lower foothills. But you're right. We'll figure it out. Jon nodded, letting his gaze wander over the crowd. Families shared blankets. An older man strummed a lute-like instrument, the notes warm and soothing. A young girl braided another girl's hair, both of them giggling. In the far corner, a group of men debated something in hushed, tense voices, likely a recent hunting dispute. Yet the overall atmosphere brimmed with a determination to survive, and a communal acceptance that they all needed one another. I wonder what the southern lords would think if they saw this, Jon mused aloud, taking another sip of ale. All these free folk living together, building, sharing. They probably wet themselves in confusion, Tormund said, and Jon couldn't help a short laugh. As the night wore on, the fires burned low and the congregation thinned as some found corners to sleep in. Outside, the blizzard raged, a relentless presence that tested every seam in the new longhouse. Jon remained awake for a time, staring at the dancing embers. He thought of Castle Black, the chill stone corridors, the vow he had once recited. My watches ended, he reminded himself, though a part of him still felt that faint pull of duty. It had simply taken a new form here in the far north. Days passed, merging into a pattern of labor, hunts, and vigilance. Jon organized a small expedition to that rumored valley the scout had spoken of, and Tormund eagerly joined. They set off with a group of about a dozen wildlings, carrying enough supplies for a week's travel through the frost fangs. Each night, they would dig a snow trench or huddle in a cave if available, fires crackling to keep the wolves at bay. Ghost ranged out ahead, often returning with a dusting of snow on his muzzle, ears pricked. It took them 4 days to reach the pass described by the scout. They trudged through waist-deep snow, passing under jagged peaks that loomed overhead. The wind funneled through the narrow defile, creating eerie whistles that echoed off the cliff faces. At times, the party had to cross precarious ice bridges formed over chasms, each step a risk. Tormund, ever fearless, took point, testing the ice with his stout spear. Jon followed, one hand on his sword hilt, though steel would do little good if the ice collapsed beneath him. When they finally emerged into the valley, the wind subsided like a sigh, leaving a quiet hush that was almost unnerving after the howling pass. Snow blanketed the basin, yet from the vantage point on a rocky outcrop, Jon could see a scattering of shapes in the distance, stone walls poking through drifts, perhaps the remains of that ancient settlement. A frozen river meandered through the valley floor, shimmering under the weak sunlight. The potential for game looked promising. He saw tracks of deer or elk near the river's edge. Tormund let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Plenty of space," he said. "We could build a second camp here if we had enough people. A fallback maybe if Stonewater Vale ever gets crowded." Jon nodded, scanning the white expanse. "We should check out those ruins. Make sure it's safe." So they descended into the valley, forging a careful path through the snowbanks. The air held a sharp bite, but at least the wind was calmer. Here and there, they spotted movement, likely hares darting between snowy bushes. The group managed to down a few with well-aimed arrows, a welcome addition to their rations. Ghost bounded ahead at times, nose to the ground, following scents that only he could detect. By mid-afternoon, they reached the edge of the ruins. Up close, Jon saw that they resembled a small fortress or stronghold. Low walls made of massive stones ringed an inner area. The architecture was indeed ancient. No mortar, just enormous blocks fitted together so tightly that even time and weather had barely loosened them. Snow piled in drifts against the walls, and a section of what might once have been a gate lay collapsed. Beyond that, broken columns and half-buried archways hinted at a larger complex. A hush fell over the group as they entered. Something about the place felt eerie, as though it remembered an age long gone. The crunch of boots on snow echoed. Tormund spat, looking around warily, while the others gripped their weapons. Jon's breath caught in his throat when he saw symbols carved into a partially exposed slab of stone. Spirals and runic lines reminiscent of the children of the forest or the early first men. It triggered a memory of the stone circles near the far northern lakes, the same swirling patterns the White Walkers had once used. He frowned, stepping closer to trace a fingertip over the grooves. "Look at this," he said quietly. Tormund came up beside him, brows knitting in confusion. "Never liked those swirly patterns," Tormund muttered. "Always felt unnatural." Jon nodded, recalling the nightmares those symbols had inspired back at the Fist of the First Men and at Hardhome. They could be warnings, or some kind of ritual marking. He glanced at the group. "Let's keep our guard up." They fanned out, exploring the interior. The fortress, if it could be called that, was largely collapsed, its ceiling caved in, walls broken. But a few enclosed chambers remained. One by one, they pushed aside snowdrifts, testing doorways that creaked with ancient weight. Inside, they found stone floors carved with more runic patterns, half covered by ice. The group discovered old storage areas filled with rotted wood and rusted metal scraps. No weapons or valuables left behind. Only the faintest suggestion of a past civilization. Jon's skin prickled as he led a smaller party into what looked like a central chamber. A half-fallen arch allowed entry, and within, they found a circular space ringed by crude pillars. A gaping hole in the ceiling let in a shaft of cold light, illuminating the swirling patterns carved into the floor. A dusting of fresh snow covered everything, reflecting the pale glow. Ghost padded in, sniffing the air warily. Tormund, stepping in behind Jon, let out a low grunt. "Feel that?" Jon felt something indeed. A subtle drop in temperature, a heaviness in the air that made each breath a touch more laborious. He'd experienced such sensations before in places steeped in old, mysterious forces. Yet, there was no immediate threat, no wights lurking in the corners. It was just the echo of something that once was. The group lingered for a moment, as though mesmerized by the hush of the chamber. "There's nothing alive here," one of the wildlings said at last, voice echoing. "We should get moving." Jon agreed. They had gleaned all they could in a cursory exploration, and it was getting late. They made camp outside the ruins in a spot where a rocky overhang offered some shelter from potential winds. Tormund led the effort to pile snow blocks into a makeshift wall, insulating their fire. That night, they roasted hare over the flames. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders at the ruin as if expecting ghosts to come crawling out of the darkness. In the glow of the fire, Jon sat with Tormund, the two of them quietly discussing their next steps. "We should map this place," Jon said. "If we can find a better approach for larger groups, it might be worth sending a proper expedition out here in the spring, once the snows melt a bit." Tormund shrugged. "Seems to me there's plenty of land. If folk keep coming to Stonewater, we might need more space, but that's a problem for another day. As for these ruins, something about them sets my teeth on edge." Jon couldn't argue. "It might just be ancient magic," he offered. "Or maybe it's just the memory of the war with the dead. Either way, we'll tread carefully." A gust of wind rattled the snow wall, causing the fire to sputter. Ghost lifted his head, ears alert, but relaxed again when the wind died. The group drifted into a fitful sleep. Jon dreamed of swirling shapes in the sky, half-formed figures beckoning him with outstretched arms. He thought he saw Daenerys, hair silver in the moonlight, reaching out with eyes that glowed like ice. He bolted awake, heart pounding, breath misting in the cold air. Gathering his composure, he leaned back on his makeshift bedroll. Sleep, it seemed, would be a rare comfort in a place that held such echoes of the old powers. At first light, they scouted a bit more, confirming the presence of elk herds near the frozen river. They also spotted the tracks of wolves, though none appeared. Pleased with the potential for additional hunting grounds, they headed back toward Stonewater Vale, retracing their path through the treacherous pass. This time, the weather held and they made good time. Upon returning, they found Stonewater bustling with new arrivals yet again. A cluster of about 30 wildlings had set up temporary camp near the longhouse. Some among them carried battered spears and recurve bows. Their leader was a tall woman with close-cropped black hair and a cautious glint in her eyes. Tormund recognized her from Har Home, greeting her with a bear-like hug and nearly lifting her off her feet. "Good to see you alive, Era," Tormund boomed, slapping her back. Era coughed a laugh. "I heard you were raising a new stronghold here, Tormund. Figured me and my people would come see if the rumors were true." Jon introduced himself quietly, and Era eyed him with a mixture of respect and wariness. "Jon Snow," she said. "We remember you. You saved a lot of us back then." Jon inclined his head. "We saved each other." Era's band proved resourceful. They brought stories of wild goats, additional fishing spots, and some skill in crude blacksmithing, hammering scavenged iron into workable tools. In exchange, they needed stable shelter for the winter. Jon walked through the camp with Era, discussing potential spots for her group to settle. She was direct, her voice firm, and it reminded him of how Mance Rayder had once united the free folk with a certain brand of charisma. Yet Era had no desire to lead all the wildlings, she said, just to keep her own people safe. The next few days saw a flurry of activity. Era's people and the Stonewater settlers worked together, raising a new ring of huts near the southern edge of the Vale. This expansion required more wood, which meant more logging expeditions into the forest, escorted by armed hunters wary of predators. The settlement scale became impressive, dozens upon dozens of shelters, each ringed by protective snow berms, with the central longhouse serving as a communal hub. Smoke rose from multiple fires, a sign that, for all the adversity, life thrived here. Jon spent his time overseeing daily matters, organizing hunts, arbitrating small disputes, planning supply usage. He didn't seek control, but the free folk increasingly looked to him for direction, an irony that wasn't lost on him, the man who'd once stood aside while others debated crowns. Sometimes he recalled Tyrion's voice in his mind, or Samwell Tarly's urging him to make decisions for the greater good. Here, that greater good was simpler: ensure everyone had enough to eat, a safe place to sleep, and a measure of hope that tomorrow wouldn't be bleaker than today. One evening, Jon convened a meeting in the longhouse with representatives from the various groups: Tormund, Era, an older wildling named Garen who'd arrived weeks before, and a few others. They sat around one of the fires, a rough circle of fur-clad figures, many with the scars of a life beyond the wall. Ghost lay behind Jon, his tail wrapped around his paws. The flickering light played across their faces, emphasizing lines of worry and resolution. "We need to think about the long winter ahead," Jon began, setting his hands on his knees. "We have more mouths to feed now. Hunting has been good, but eventually game might move further north or become scarce near the Vale. We'll need to expand our range." Era nodded. "We have some hunters who can venture deeper into the mountains. But that means more danger." Tormund chimed in with a crooked grin. "We're used to danger. But maybe we can send a few scouting parties to see if there are safer passes. We found one recently to a new valley." He gestured to Jon. "Ruins there, but also plenty of elk." Garen, a wiry man with graying hair, fiddled with the hilt of his knife. We've also heard rumors that some men still linger near the coast, more raiders than free folk. We should be careful. If they catch wind of a thriving settlement here, they might try to pillage. Or they might prefer to join if we can convince them. Jon gazed at the faces around the fire. Each carried a will to survive, tempered by the knowledge that unity was their best defense against the elements and any potential threats. We'll organize better patrols, he said. I don't want any raiding parties catching us by surprise. And if they're free folk, maybe they'll be reasonable. We can offer them a place here, so long as they follow our ways. Aerys snorted, but not unkindly. Free folk can be stubborn. But we'll see. Better to persuade them than fight them. The discussion continued for some time, delving into matters of trade, skill sharing, and the possibility of forging a path south to see if the Night's Watch or Winterfell might be open to exchanging goods. Jon felt a knot in his chest when Winterfell was mentioned. A pang of longing to see Sansa or Arya flickered in him, but he knew he couldn't go back. Not so soon, not without risking a wave of conflict or complicated politics. Perhaps, in time, the realm would let him be. For now, Stonewater was his duty, these people his responsibility by default of their trust. The winter deepened and the settlement adapted. Tormund spearheaded a tradition of weekly feasts, small celebrations to bolster morale. Even if the fare was nothing more than stewed hare and dried berries, the gatherings in the longhouse gave everyone a chance to socialize, exchange tales, and forget the gnawing cold for a few hours. Jon was often drawn into circles of conversation against his will, wildlings eager to hear more about the wars in the south, the dragons, the fate of King's Landing. He answered gently, downplaying his role, mindful that describing the city's destruction served no purpose but to rekindle dark memories. But some nights, after such feasts, he'd slip away into the darkness, away from the fires and prying eyes. Ghost would follow at a distance as though sensing Jon's need for space. Jon would climb a small rise near the outskirts of the Vale and gaze upon the moonlit snow, the sky glittering with stars. Up here, the wind carried an austere whisper that both chilled and comforted him. He remembered nights on the wall, scanning for whites, or in the Godwood at Winterfell, seeking solace. It struck him that perhaps this had always been his fate, a solitary figure, never entirely of one place, carrying burdens that no one else wanted. Here, though, at least he felt a sense of purpose that was untainted by power struggles. One such night, Tormund found him perched on that small rise, cloak whipping around his legs. Tormund approached without stealth, he was incapable of it, and dropped down beside Jon. Together, they stared at the expanse of snow and pine, the silhouettes of huts below marked by flickering torchlight. "Why do you come up here alone?" Tormund asked, voice subdued. Jon shrugged. "Sometimes I need to think. Or not think." Tormund grunted in understanding. But you know, you don't have to carry everything by yourself. These people would follow you into the darkest night if you asked. You've done enough for them." Jon expelled a frosty breath. "I'm not leading them. They lead themselves. Don't fool yourself. You and I both know they look to you. That's not necessarily a bad thing." Jon took a moment to answer. A swirl of wind kicked up a cloud of powdery snow around them. "I've seen what happens when one person holds too much power," he said quietly, an unbidden image of Daenerys flashing through his mind. "I don't want that. I want them to be free, truly free. No kneeling. No heavy-handed rule. Just cooperation if they choose it." Tormund studied him with an odd fondness. "You're like a man trying to tame a wolf pack without becoming its alpha. Maybe you'll manage it. I've never seen the free folk so willing to settle like this, though. We used to roam, winter or summer, never in one place too long. But here, well, maybe the winters are so bad we'd rather stick together." Jon's gaze lingered on the cluster of huts. They have families, children. They want stability, a future that doesn't involve running from the next threat. That's worth building. Tormund scratched at his beard. "So what's next, then?" "Next," Jon said, exhaling, "we ensure we can last through the deep winter. After that, maybe we do see if the southern kingdoms are open to trade. Maybe we explore more valleys. We'll take it one step at a time." He left unspoken the possibility that the southerners might yet come for him. The father inside Ned Stark had once told Jon about the weight of an executed justice, about carrying a sword only when necessary. Jon had carried out the ultimate justice on Daenerys, as he believed, but the realm might label him a murderer, a traitor. He didn't fear their judgment anymore. Just the harm they might bring to these free folk if they decided to press the matter. Tormund nodded, standing up with a grunt. "Well, let's get some sleep then. We'll tackle tomorrow's problems tomorrow." He headed back down the slope, pausing only to look over his shoulder and wave for Jon to follow. Jon stayed a few minutes longer in silence, letting the cold wind sting his cheeks as if reminding him that he was alive. Snowmelt and the faintest hint of thaw eventually arrived, the days growing marginally longer. The Vale turned muddy in places, making travel an exercise in slogging through slush and half-frozen ground. Game became more active, and hunts improved, allowing the settlement to restock on fresh meat. Tormund led a party out to the newly discovered valley, returning with tales of an even bigger elk herd than they'd first suspected. The potential for expansion seemed endless, so long as they could handle the challenges of distance and terrain. Yet amidst these developments, a sudden commotion erupted one afternoon when a pair of weary travelers rode into the settlement on horses, no less. This was uncommon enough among the free folk, who typically walked or used simpler mounts. The travelers appeared to be from the Night's Watch, judging by their black cloaks, though they were ragged and stained from travel. The entire camp bristled with caution. Old enmities between wildlings and the Watch still lingered, even if Jon Snow's efforts had once bridged the gap. Jon hurried to the center of camp, Ghost loping by his side, to see what was happening. He recognized one of the riders, Daenerys Ed's cousin, if he recalled correctly, though he struggled for the man's name. The rider dismounted with stiff limbs, scanning the faces of the assembled free folk until his gaze landed on Jon. A flicker of recognition and relief showed in his eyes. "Jon Snow," he said, voice hoarse. "We've been searching for you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tormund stepped close, hand on his axe, not in open threat but caution. "And who are you?" The man drew back his hood, revealing short, bristly hair and a battered face. "Sereth of the Night's Watch. This is Branel, my companion. We've come from Castle Black with news." Jon frowned. The Watch rarely ventures this far unless something's wrong. Sereth nodded gravely. "Aye. We need your help, Jon. Our numbers are few, and there's talk that a host of outlaws is moving north, past the Gift, claiming they have a score to settle. We believe they might be aiming to cross the wall, maybe to find you." Tormund let out a low growl. "Fools. As if the cold won't kill them first." Sereth shook his head. "They're not alone. There are rumors they have some supporters in the north, men discontent with the new rule. We fear they might have enough resources to make the crossing, especially if they find the tunnels or weaker sections of the wall." Jon absorbed this information, a knot forming in his chest. So it was happening. The southern realm hadn't forgotten. Perhaps these outlaws thought to claim vengeance for Daenerys, or maybe they were loyal to some other cause. In any case, the idea of a hostile force breaching the wall threatened not just Jon, but the free folks' hard-won peace. "Who leads them?" Jon asked quietly. Sereth shifted uneasily. "We're not sure. Some say a minor lord from the Vale of Arryn, others a band of Sellswords with a grudge. We just know they're rumored to be heading for Castle Black. Grey Worm and the Unsullied left Westeros months ago, but others may have taken up the banner of retribution. If they break through the wall, we can't stop them alone. Most of the Watch has deserted, with only a few dozen men left." Silence settled over the gathering. Jon saw the looks of fear and anger on the free folks' faces. They had no desire to fight another war, especially not with the southern host crossing the wall. Tormund spat into the mud. "I'll be damned if we let them march in here." Jon placed a hand on Tormund's shoulder, calming him. "We need to think carefully. A direct confrontation could be bloody. But if we do nothing, they'll come here eventually." Someone in the crowd shouted, "We'll fight them. Drive them back." Others muttered agreement, but also fear. They remembered the storms of steel and fire from the last great battles. Sereth cleared his throat. "We rode north to warn you. But also, Castle Black stands vulnerable. If they breach it, the gates or the hidden passages, they'll have a direct path. The Watch might not hold." Jon studied the man's face, reading the desperation there. The Night's Watch might mean little to the free folk historically, but that last war had changed alliances. He nodded slowly, feeling the familiar pull of duty, even though he was no longer sworn to that black cloak. "I understand," he said. "Gather your strength. We'll talk more in the Longhouse." He dismissed the crowd, telling them to return to their tasks but remain vigilant. Then he escorted Sereth and Branel to the Longhouse, where Tormund, Aera, and a few key individuals joined them. Ghost followed silently, his presence a reminder of Jon's dual identity, once a crow, now a free man of the north. Inside, the Night's Watchmen warmed themselves by the fire, their shoulders still tense. Tormund loomed near them, arms crossed. Jon settled onto a wooden bench and gestured for them to speak. Sereth recounted what little they knew, scattered rumors that a band of at least 100 men, possibly more, had set out from the region near the Trident. Their stated purpose was uncertain. Some said they wanted to capture or kill the traitor who'd murdered the Dragon Queen, others said they wanted to scour the far north for rumored treasures or dragon eggs. In any case, they were headed up the King's Road, ignoring new boundaries, and had made violent raids on villages loyal to the Starks. Jon's jaw tightened. This was precisely the kind of conflict he had hoped to avoid by leaving Westeros behind. Yet it was here, on his doorstep. We can't allow them to slip through the wall, he said, meeting Tormund's eyes. They'll bring destruction with them. That's not what we fought for. Era nodded in agreement, her expression grim. But we won't just wait for them to show up, will we? That's too risky. They could slip in from any point. We don't know how well they're organized. Tormund cracked his knuckles. Jon, you know the tunnels and fortifications better than any of us. If we want to stop them, we should meet them at Castle Black or even further south and seal any paths they might take. Jon drew in a slow breath. Once more, the burden of decision settled upon him. He looked at Sereth. How many men remain at Castle Black? Barely 30, maybe? And that includes old veterans who've served since before the Long Night, Sereth replied, a trace of shame in his tone. We can't hold the wall on our own. Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower are abandoned or nearly so. Jon nodded. If this band is only 100, we might stand a chance if we unite the Free Folk and what's left of the Watch. Use the wall's defenses against them. But if they're more? Tormund snorted. We can muster a few hundred Free Folk who can fight. More if we call from other camps nearby. But that'll mean leaving Stonewater Vale vulnerable to raids or beasts. Era tapped her fingers on the table. We might have to risk it. If we let this band come north unchallenged, they'll do worse to us here than any predator could. We'd be fighting them on our own ground with women and children in the crossfire. A tense silence followed. Jon saw the reluctance in Tormund's eyes. Neither of them wanted to drag the Free Folk into another war. But these men threatened everything they'd built. Finally, Jon spoke, his voice low. All right? We ride south to Castle Black. We'll gather as many volunteers as we can, leaving enough behind to protect the settlement. When we reach the wall, we fortify it. If need be, we meet this band on the southern side, where we can prevent them from crossing. If they come in peace, we'll hear them out, but I doubt it's peace they want. If they want war, we'll give them a war they won't forget. A rumble of agreement passed around the group, though no one seemed eager for a fight. Tormund's grin returned, albeit grimly. Finally, some old-fashioned excitement. I was starting to worry we'd grow soft in this cozy vale. Era stood, firelight gleaming on the metal studs of her leather armor. I'll rally my hunters and fighters. We'll leave a small guard behind with the children and those unable to travel. Sereth exhaled relief. Thank you, Jon Snow. Without you, Castle Black would surely fall. Jon managed a tight nod. He left unspoken his own uncertainty that maybe this was exactly what he'd wanted to avoid. But fate had a way of circling back, dragging him into conflicts he tried to escape. At least now he had allies who stood by him not because of a crown, but because they believed in him. That was something. Preparations began swiftly. An air of resolve settled over Stonewater Vale. Wildlings checked weapons, repaired spears, sharpened axes. Sledges were readied for supplies. Children looked on, some frightened, some excited by the prospect of seeing the Great Wall they'd only heard about in stories. Tormund roamed from hut to hut, recruiting volunteers with a mixture of bravado and camaraderie. Era coordinated provisions, ensuring they had enough dried meat and fish to last the journey. Jon oversaw it all, quietly giving instructions, making sure those staying behind would be safe. He found a moment alone to secure his personal gear. His sword, sheathed in well-worn leather, felt heavy in his hands, an artifact from his time as Lord Commander. He checked the edge, tested the balance. Ghost watched him with an almost accusatory gaze, as if to say, here we go again. Jon patted the direwolf's head. One more time, he murmured, I promise. Ghost just blinked, unconvinced. They set out the next morning, a column of about 100 men and women moving across the snowy terrain. Another 20 or so stayed behind to guard the vale. The group included the 2 Night's Watch riders, some of Era's best hunters, Tormund's rowdy circle of veteran fighters, and a smattering of younger free folk eager to prove themselves. Jon led from the front, with Tormund at his side. The sky hung gray, a dull promise of more snow, but for the moment, the weather held. Travel was arduous but not unfamiliar. The group forged a path west, aiming to skirt the worst of the frost fangs before heading south. With the partial thaw, some streams rushed with cold meltwater, requiring the construction of makeshift bridges. Occasionally, they stumbled upon old tracks that might belong to mammoths or giants, but none of those creatures had been seen in the area since the final battles against the dead. At night, they made camp in clusters ringed by watchfires. Jon took turns on guard duty, peering into the darkness as wind rustled pines. On the fourth day of travel, they encountered a ragged party of free folk who were fleeing something. They recognized Jon and Tormund crying out for aid. When asked what had driven them out, they stammered about a band of armed Southerners wearing mismatched armor who had butchered one of their outriders and threatened to kill them all if they didn't reveal the whereabouts of Jon Snow. Fear and anger pulsed through Jon's veins as he listened. The band the Night's Watch had warned about was closer than expected, already harassing free folk. Tormund's jaw tightened. They're crossing the land, murdering and threatening. We'll make them pay. Jon steadied his friend. We should be smart about this. Rushing in could get us all killed if they have superior numbers. They gave the fleeing free folk some supplies and directed them towards Stonewater Vale, telling them it was safer there. Then they pressed onward, more cautious than before. Scouts ranged out ahead, scanning for sign of the hostile group. They found signs of old camps, half-eaten food scattered in a hurry, footprints in the melting snow. This group was large, possibly around 100 to 200 strong, as best the scouts could tell. Jon's column was slightly smaller, but they knew the terrain and had the advantage of a single, unified purpose. If the outlaws fought purely for vengeance or greed, that gave Jon hope his people's cohesion could best them. Still, a fight in open terrain would be risky. Jon decided their best bet was to reach Castle Black first, rally the few men of the Watch and hold the fortress. The wall had defenses that could repel a larger force if used wisely. Tormund agreed, though he made it clear he'd prefer to hunt down the outlaws in the field. Jon, however, insisted that defending behind stone and ice was the more prudent course. The journey wore on. They skirted the edge of a forest where ravens cawed overhead. On the 8th day, as the column emerged onto an expanse of rolling hills covered in patchy snow, they caught their first distant glimpse of the wall, a shadowy line rising against the horizon. An odd mixture of nostalgia and dread filled Jon's chest. He remembered standing atop that icy rampart, feeling the wind scour his face, scanning the wilderness for white activity. Now he was returning under an entirely different threat. Castle Black itself loomed in the distance, a familiar silhouette of stone towers and wooden stairs climbing the great ice. Jon recalled the times he'd walked those very stairs, conferring with Sam, or the nights he'd spent on the ramparts under a sea of stars. The gate was open, and as they drew closer, a horn blast sounded. Men in black cloaks milled about uncertainly, aiming crossbows from the battlements. But when Sereth rode forward, waving, the crossbows lowered. A crowd gathered in the courtyard, the men of the Night's Watch gawking at the wildling fighters pouring in. Jon dismounted, scanning the worn faces of the Black brothers. It was a pitifully small group, their armor mismatched and their expressions weary. An older brother with a white beard stepped forward, leaning on a spear. Jon recognized him vaguely from his time as Lord Commander, though the man looked 10 years older now. Lord Commander Snow, he rasped, then caught himself. I mean, Jon Snow. Jon shook his head gently. I'm no longer Lord Commander, but we're here to help you hold this place. The man's eyes flicked to Tormund and the wildlings. Well, you're the best help we could hope for. We've been hearing rumors of an outlaw band heading this way. Jon nodded, explaining what they knew. The older brother, Wylas, confirmed that scouting parties had spotted them to the south, harassing local hamlets near the Gift. They were likely only a day or two's march away. Tormund cursed under his breath while Aera tightened her gloves as if itching for a fight. Then we have little time, Jon said. We need to prepare the defenses. How are the gates, the walls, the stores of oil or pitch? Wylas grimaced. We've done what we can. The gates hold, but we don't have many archers. We have some barrels of pitch left, but not enough to hold off a determined force for long. Jon nodded, turning to Tormund, Aera, and the others. We'll set up barricades in the courtyard. Position archers on the towers. If we can, we'll fortify the walls around the tunnel. They'll have to come through that gate if they want to cross north. Tormund grinned. We can bottle them up in there and cut them down. The free folk poured into Castle Black, many for the first time. Their faces showed a mixture of apprehension. This had been an enemy fortress for generations, and curiosity at the size of it. Ghost padded through the courtyard, his presence causing mutters among the Black brothers who remembered the direwolf. Jon wasted no time organizing squads, some to gather rubble and wood to build barricades, others to sharpen stakes. Aera's hunters took the towers, checking lines of sight for arrows. Tormund led a team that would hold the main gate. As night fell, the fortress buzzed with frantic activity. Fires burned in braziers to keep archers warm. The men of the watch, though few, seemed relieved to have reinforcements. Sentries were posted along the top of the wall as well, scanning the horizon for movement. The cold air bit at any exposed skin, a sharp reminder of the environment's danger. Yet the presence of so many free folk ironically made Castle Black feel more alive than it had in years. Jon walked the battlements, checking in with each group. He recalled the weight he'd carried as Lord Commander, the burden of every decision. This time, at least, he didn't have to worry about the White Walkers, about an existential threat that defied comprehension. These were living foes, men with steel swords and flawed hearts. He paused at a corner of the rampart that overlooked the southern approach. In the fading light, he could see the silhouette of the King's Road trailing off. Somewhere out there, the enemy marched, likely armed and convinced of their cause. He felt a pang of regret that blood would be spilled yet again. But if they intended to kill innocents, to ravage the free folk, he would not stand by. Just before he headed back down, Tormund joined him, the wind ruffling his fiery hair. "Reminds me of old times, eh? Defending this ice block from those who'd do us harm." Jon's mouth curved into a grim line. "I never thought I'd be here again." Tormund slapped him on the back. "Maybe the gods have a sense of humor. But we'll do what needs doing." They descended into the courtyard to finalize the plan. A messenger scout came rushing in after midnight, breath steaming. He reported that the enemy band was camped only a few miles down the road. By dawn, they'd likely be at the gates. Steadying themselves, Jon and his companions bedded down for a few hours of restless sleep, weapons close at hand. Morning broke gray and cold, the sky threatening snow. The defenders took positions on the walls and behind barricades in the courtyard. Jon stood near the gate with Tormund, both of them peering through arrow slits to watch the approach. Sure enough, by mid-morning, a line of figures began to appear in the distance, men on horseback, others on foot, banners torn and frayed. Even from afar, Jon could see their ranks bulged with what looked like desperate Sel's words, a motley collection of mercenaries and renegade knights, plus ragged peasants who'd been swept up in the cause. A few carried crude flags or battered sigils that Jon didn't recognize, some featuring a black dragon on red cloth that had evidently been defaced or repurposed. They marched close, halting out of arrow range. One man on a horse rode forward, presumably their leader. He wore old Lannister plate, tarnished and ill-fitting. Raising a horn to his lips, he gave a single, echoing blast. Then he bellowed up at the walls, his voice hoarse, "We know you're in there, Jon Snow. Come out and face us, or we'll tear down this damned wall stone by stone." Jon exchanged a look with Tormund, whose lips curled in a sneer. Era and her hunters knocked arrows from the parapets. Jon ascended to a vantage point on the rampart, stepping forward just enough to be seen. "I am Jon Snow," he called down. "Who leads you and what do you want here?" The man removed his helmet, revealing greasy hair and a scarred cheek. "The name's Carlton Storm. We come for justice, for the murder of our rightful queen, Daenerys Targaryen. You'll pay for your treason with blood, or you can surrender to us now and spare these fools a fight they can't win." A disquiet fell over the defenders at the name of Daenerys. Many of the free folk didn't care about southern queens, but they knew Jon had once allied with her. Jon's chest tightened. So they were remnants of those who still believed in her cause, seeking vengeance. He'd feared such a day would come. "The war is over," Jon replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Daenerys fell months ago by her own actions. If you want to talk, we can talk. But you won't find what you're looking for here." Carlton spat, the gesture barely visible but his contempt clear. "We've no interest in talk with a traitor. You'll turn yourself over to us, or we'll put this entire fortress to the torch and hunt down anyone who stands in our way." Tormund let out a roar from beside Jon. "You're welcome to try, you spineless cur. We'll mount your heads on spikes." The free folk shouted in agreement, brandishing weapons. Carlton's forces stirred restlessly, men looking up at the walls with a mixture of bravado and unease. Jon knew there would be no peaceful resolution. This was a band of men fueled by hatred and revenge. He felt the weight of that final conversation with Daenerys in the Red Keep, how the realm might call him a murderer, but how he'd acted to save countless lives. If these men couldn't see reason, so be it. "I cannot surrender," he shouted, voice carrying over the wind. "Turn back now, and you'll keep your lives. Press on, and you'll find only death." Carlton sneered. "So be it. Archers, forward." Within moments, the outlaws began to search. They advanced in ragged formation, archers loosing arrows at the walls. Jon ducked as a volley rattled off the stone parapets. Era's hunters answered with deadly accuracy, sending arrows plunging down into the mass below. Screams erupted as men fell, but the rest charged forward, dragging crude siege equipment, battering rams, ladders that looked hastily assembled. At Carlton's command, they rushed the gate. "Hold positions. Jon roared and the defenders braced themselves. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained from the ramparts, felling more attackers. Tormund and a crew of wildlings manned the gate, ready with spears to thrust through murder holes. As the battering ram struck, the thick wooden door shuddered. Even with the gate barred, it might not hold forever if enough men hammered at it. A few ladders slammed against the walls. Era led her archers in targeting them, pushing them away or sending men toppling. Some defenders tossed down rocks or poured heated pitch, though supplies were limited. The stench of burning flesh and screams rose around them. Jon's stomach churned, but he focused on the necessity of defense. He loosed arrow after arrow at the men below, aiming carefully to avoid pointless suffering. Despite their ragtag nature, the outlaws had numbers and a fierce desperation. They kept swarming, some scrambling up ladders only to be cut down at the top. A handful made it onto the ramparts, engaging in close-quarters fights with the free folk. Jon drew his sword when one attacker lunged at him, a tall man swinging a spiked mace. Jon parried, the steel jarring his arms, then slipped inside the man's guard to drive the blade into his chest. The man collapsed with a ragged gasp. Blood spattered the cold stones. Jon pivoted, blocking another blow from a wild-eyed raider. The clang of steel reverberated. Ghost appeared from behind, sinking his fangs into the raider's arm, dragging him down. Jon stepped around the dying man, looking for Tormund. He spotted the big wildling in the courtyard, roaring as he hacked at attackers who'd forced their way through a side gate. The free folk fought around him, forming a ring that funneled more outlaws to their doom. Sparks flew as the battering ram struck the main gate again and again. Jon shouted for the defenders to brace it, but cracks started to appear in the heavy timbers. Carleton's men cheered, smelling victory. The next blow rattled the entire structure. Then, with a deafening splintering sound, the gate collapsed inward. A flood of outlaws poured into the courtyard. The Black Brothers and wildlings rushed to meet them, forming a shield wall of sorts. Jon scrambled down from the ramparts, calling for reinforcements. The courtyard became a storm of blades, men colliding in chaos and blood. Tormund led a furious counterattack, hurling himself at the forefront. Era's hunters fired from the walls, picking off as many as they could. In the melee, Jon found himself face-to-face with Carleton Storm. The scarred man grinned through bared teeth, sword glinting. The traitor shows himself, he snarled. Daenerys' death demands blood. They clashed. Carleton was strong, though not particularly skilled, relying on brute force. Jon fought with a more measured style, parrying and dodging. Around them, men died in droves, the snow turned red underfoot. Ghost lunged at an attacker who tried to blindside Jon, sinking fangs into the man's leg. Jon blocked a heavy overhead strike from Carleton, wincing as the impact reverberated through his arms. He twisted, slamming his hilt into Carleton's helmet. The man staggered, shaking his head. Somewhere behind Jon, Tormund bellowed, "Push them back. Drive them out." The free folk mustered a fierce surge, pressing the outlaws toward the shattered gate. Carleton snarled, feinting to Jon's left before lunging again. Jon sidestepped, hooking his foot around Carleton's ankle. The bigger man lost balance, stumbling to one knee. In that heartbeat, Jon's sword lashed out, slicing across Carleton's shoulder. The raider howled, rolling away. A wave of attackers broke under the free folks' rally. Era's archers rained deadly shafts from above. Some outlaws fled, others fought to the last. Carleton, bleeding, tried to regain his footing. Jon advanced, sword raised, chest heaving. "This can end," he said, breath ragged. "Call off your men. It's over." Carleton spat bloody spittle. "You ended it when you killed her." Summoning a final burst of rage, he swung wildly. Jon blocked and countered, driving his blade into Carleton's chest. A gasp left the man's lips, eyes wide with shock. Then he crumpled to the ground, sword clattering away. Jon stood there for a moment, staring down at the dying man, chest tight with old grief. Another life claimed by the echoes of that fateful day in the throne room. The courtyard still rang with clashes of steel, but the momentum had shifted. Leaderless, the remaining outlaws tried to flee, only to be cut down or captured by the defenders. When the last of them either lay dead or had thrown down weapons in surrender, Castle Black fell silent, save for the groans of the wounded. The gate was ruined, bodies strewn about. Smoke from the braziers mingled with the metallic scent of blood. Tormund, splattered in gore, surveyed the aftermath with grim satisfaction. Era descended from the walls, her bow in hand, scowling at the carnage. The men of the Night's Watch slumped in exhaustion, having fought more fiercely than their meager numbers suggested they could. Jon exhaled, feeling the toll in every muscle, every bruise. Ghost limped over, muzzle stained red, and leaned against Jon's leg. A wave of sorrow washed through him for the lives lost, but relief too, the outlaws had been thwarted. Castle Black stood. Stonewater Vale would remain safe, at least from this threat. He crouched by Carlton's body. The man's eyes stared blankly at the sky. Had Daenerys truly commanded such devotion that men would travel leagues, risking death, to avenge her? Or had vengeance simply given them purpose in a world turned upside down? Either way, it was done. Tormund placed a bloody hand on Jon's shoulder. "We did it," he said softly, though there was no triumph in his voice. "They won't threaten us again." Jon rose slowly, exhaustion radiating through him. "See to the wounded," he told Tormund and Aera. "We'll give the dead what respect we can." The wildlings began the grim work of gathering bodies, separating their own fallen from the outlaws, tending to the injured. Jon helped as best he could, though fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. He bound wounds, offered water to the dying, and assisted the Black brothers in hauling debris to clear a path for the living. The day wore on, shadowed by clouds and the weight of so many dead. At sunset, they built pyres just beyond the collapsed gate, the wind carrying the smell of smoke over the ramparts. The free folk said their own prayers, the Night's Watch recited the occasional phrase from the old rites, though the words felt hollow in the face of such violence. Jon stood apart, arms crossed over his chest, Ghost at his side. He thought of Daenerys one last time. Her idealism, her fiery passion, and the final, terrible day in King's Landing. Here lay men who believed they were avenging her. But revenge had only led to more senseless death. What had it gained them? Perhaps that was the lesson the realm never learned: violence begot violence, a cycle with no end. Except in these quiet moments, with the stench of burnt flesh heavy in the air, Jon recognized a flicker of gratitude that at least the free folk he cared for had survived. Stonewater Vale would endure. The Night's Watch, battered though it was, had not crumbled. Later, in the ruins of Castle Black's common hall, the leaders gathered to recount the casualty lists. A handful of free folk had fallen along with a few Black brothers, but the cost was far less than if they'd been overrun. Aera's archers had been decisive, as had Tormund's ferocious frontline assault. Sereth and Wylas thanked Jon profusely, bowing their heads in deference. But Jon only felt hollow. Killing other men always left him that way. "What now?" Tormund asked, once they concluded the grim tally. Jon rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw. "We'll repair the gate as best we can. Then, I suppose we return to Stonewater Vale. The Night's Watch can keep guard here. If more come, at least they'll think twice after this defeat." The Black brothers nodded, relieved. No one suggested that Jon remain as Lord Commander. They sensed he had moved beyond that role. Instead, they asked only that he help coordinate repairs, which he agreed to. Over the next week, the Free Folk and the Watch worked side by side to replace the shattered gate with a sturdy barricade of logs and iron bands. It wasn't as strong as the original, but it would hold for a time. They even set up watchtowers along the perimeter to guard against more southern intruders. The outlaws who had surrendered were given a choice: take the Black and serve on the wall for the rest of their days, or head south in shame, unarmed. A few accepted the Black, though Jon suspected they'd desert at the earliest opportunity. Most trudged south, broken men. Jon harbored no illusions that the realm was free of trouble, but for now at least, the immediate threat had been repelled. When the repairs were complete, Jon and Tormund prepared to depart. Aera's band, too, was eager to return to Stonewater Vale, their homes and families. They bade farewell to the Black brothers, who stood in a line in the courtyard, gazing at the assembled free folk with a curious mix of respect and lingering wariness. Sereth, the younger rider who had first brought the warning, clasped Jon's hand. "Thank you," he said, meeting Jon's eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd come. But you saved us." Jon nodded, lips pressed thin. "Castle Black was my home once. I couldn't let it fall." Wylas approached as well, leaning on a spear. "If the realm sees fit to come for you again, we'll do our best to warn you." "You've earned that much, Jon Snow." Tormund smirked. The crows and the free folk working together, Mance would have been proud. They left Castle Black behind, traveling north along the winding trails. Spring's faint promise danced on the breeze, a slight thaw, the drip of melting icicles from pine branches, a pale sun that lasted a fraction longer each day. The journey felt lighter without the specter of an impending battle. At campfires each evening, the free folk shared relief and stories of the fight, boasting of their kills or near escapes. Jon listened more than he spoke, haunted by the memory of Carlton's final glare. He wondered if the hatred for him would ever truly vanish from the south, or if more such bands would come. When at last Stonewater Vale's familiar ridges and pine stands came into view, the returning party let out cheers. Smoke rose from the huts, a sign of normal life continuing. Those who had stayed behind rushed out to greet them, relief visible on every face at seeing mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters return. Children flung themselves into waiting arms. Tormund let out a triumphant roar that echoed off the snow-laden slopes, while Aera embraced her kin. Jon slipped away amid the reunion, smiling at the tearful embraces. He made his way to the slope above the river where fresh snowmelt cascaded over rocks. Ghost padded by his side, nose to the ground. Jon gazed over the vale where so many huts now stood that it looked almost like a village. In the distance, he heard the happy shrieks of children, the lively bustle of a community that had been spared from war's worst horrors. He thought of how close they'd come to losing this haven if the outlaws had succeeded. But they hadn't. Jon's mind flickered through the images of the final battle, the free folk standing firm beside him, the men of the Night's Watch who had once been sworn enemies. A sense of weary pride welled up in him. For all his regrets, for all the blood spilled, he had protected these people, at least for now. And that, perhaps, was enough. Tormund found him eventually, trudging up the slope with fresh snow clinging to his boots. "There you are, H," he said. "The folks are asking about you. Some want to hear the story of the battle, how you skewered that Carlton fellow." Jon sighed with a small shake of his head. "I have no taste for war stories. We did what had to be done." Tormund folded his arms, studying Jon. "Aye, that we did. But maybe they just want to celebrate that you came back. You're part of them now, Jon Snow. Not some distant hero." A faint smile tugged at Jon's lips. "I'll come down soon. Just needed a moment." Tormund nodded. "Take your time. We'll start a fire, cook something decent. Might even have some ale left." He gave Jon a fond clap on the back and tromped off, leaving footprints in the slushy snow. Jon turned his gaze northward where jagged peaks rose in the distance. His breath fogged in the crisp air. This was his home now, for better or worse. The ghosts of the past would never fully vanish, Daenerys, the battles, the memory of the Iron Throne twisted by dragonfire, but maybe here, among the free folk, he could find a life of quiet purpose. A life not defined by swords and crowns, but by the steady rhythms of survival, community, and the bond between people who chose to stand together rather than tear each other apart. Ghost nudged Jon's hand with a cold nose, and Jon absently scratched the direwolf's ears. "Come on," he murmured, turning back to the vale. "Let's rejoin the others." He followed the path down, hearing voices rise in laughter and relief. Children scurried past, shouting greetings. Someone tossed him a grin as though to say, "Welcome home." And for the first time in a long while, the words sank into Jon's heart, carrying a promise that this might just be a place where he belonged, no longer the reluctant king or the haunted commander, but simply a man who had found a measure of peace in the unrelenting northern wild. He walked among them, hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, though not in aggression. The blade was just a tool when needed, not a symbol of power. Around him, the free folk carried on, some prepared meals, others checked weapons or tended to the chores of daily life. Each face he passed shone with gratitude. Many nodded or smiled, some patted his arm. He responded with a quiet warmth and acknowledgement that they were all in this together. Settling by one of the communal fires, Jon accepted a wooden bowl of stew from a kindly older woman. He sipped the broth, letting the warmth spread through his chest. Tormund soon appeared with a flagon of ale, filling cups for a small group of fighters recounting the day's events. Jon listened, occasionally offering a word or two. The free folk told it more colorfully than he ever could. Tormund's roars, Era's arrows raining from the walls, the thunderous crash of the gate. They all cast him glances, wanting him to confirm or deny bits of exaggeration, but he simply smiled. If their embellishments brought them a sense of pride and unity, let them have it. As night fell, the vale glowed with scattered torches. Snow drifted gently, adding another layer of hush to the scene. Families retired to their huts while others lingered by the fires, singing or talking softly. Jon eventually made his way to his own humble shelter, feeling the ache in his limbs from the battle. He unbuckled his sword belt, setting it aside, and rolled his shoulders to ease the tension. Ghost curled at the entrance, half keeping watch. Jon lay down on the pile of furs that served as his bed. Weariness tugged at him, but so did a faint sense of hope. It was different from the naive hope he'd had when first bending the knee to Daenerys, or from the desperate hope of surviving the long night. This felt more grounded, rooted in the daily reality of life here. He closed his eyes, the sounds of the vale drifting through the thin walls, someone coughing, a baby's faint cry, muffled laughter from a distant fire. It was messy, real, and entirely free of thrones. When sleep claimed him, his dreams were of the far north, of snowy forests bathed in moonlight, of a river running with meltwater, of Ghost's soft footfalls alongside him. And though a trace of sorrow lingered in the corners of his mind for all that had been lost, the dream was gentle. It carried him through the night in a quiet hush, as if the true north was whispering that, at last, he might lay his burdens down. In the days that followed, Stonewater Vale resumed its steady rhythm. Jon and Tormund sent out small patrols to ensure no other outlaw bands approached. Era helped expand the settlement's hunting efforts, venturing into the rolling foothills where spring's thaw revealed patches of new grass. Children played near the river, giggling as they tried to catch fish with makeshift nets. At times, Jon would see the older free folk teaching the younger generation about the old ways, how to read the tracks of animals, how to craft a bow from local timber, how to find edible roots beneath the snow. A self-sufficient culture blossomed, shaped by the unique mix of all these different clans who had come together. Some of the men and women began to speak of building more permanent structures, log cabins with stone fireplaces that could withstand the harshest winters. They sketched out ideas in the dirt, discussing where to quarry stone or how to preserve timber. Bit by bit, a vision emerged of a lasting community, not just a temporary camp. Jon found himself smiling when he heard them talk about the future with such confidence. It was a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had ruled their lives before. Though occasionally a pang of guilt would surface, memories of King's Landing, of Daenerys, and the devastation, Jon found it easier to push them aside here. The present demanded his focus, ensuring Stonewater Vale remained stable, forging alliances with neighboring free folk camps, and quietly watching the horizon in case any southern threat reemerged. The nightmares grew less frequent. Sometimes he awoke in the dark, sweat chilling his skin, convinced he heard the roar of dragons. But Ghost's calm presence and the Vale's reality soon grounded him again. Tormund thrived in this environment. His booming laugh often carried across the settlement as he boasted about the next hunting trip or teased younger men into contests of strength. If Jon represented the quiet watchfulness, Tormund was the settlement's beating heart, lifting spirits with a body tale or a hearty challenge. Their friendship deepened through shared responsibility and mutual respect. Where once Tormund had joked about the crow and teased him for his brooding, now he addressed Jon as an equal partner in shaping a future. Era, too, emerged as a prominent figure. She trained a small corps of archers, teaching them to shoot swiftly and accurately. Women and men alike joined her lessons, drawn by her fierce competence. In spare moments, she and Jon would discuss the settlement's needs, where best to collect medicinal herbs, how to store grain if they attempted a small crop come summer. She never showed interest in leading the entire community, but she took pride in organizing defenses and hunts. Jon recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who had seen enough war to value quiet but who would still fight if necessary. As the weeks passed, the mild spring slowly yielded to a still chilly summer, far less warm than the southern summers, yet enough to melt the snows around the Vale. Grass sprang up in patches of green, flowers tentatively bloomed near the riverbank, and small gardens were attempted in the newly thawed soil. The days lengthened, sunlight lingering late into the evening. People smiled more, children ran barefoot in the meadows. It was a stark transformation from the biting cold they had endured. Jon found himself at the heart of a burgeoning settlement that bore no official name or banner. Some simply called it Stonewater Vale after the combination of rock and flowing river. Others called it Snow's Vale, half in jest, but Jon discouraged that. He didn't want his name tied to it in a way that suggested he was lord or ruler. Yet the free folk insisted that he'd brought them together, a sentiment Tormund was only too happy to proclaim in his boisterous manner. On a day when the sun hung bright in the sky, Jon wandered out to the perimeter of the settlement where a small stand of pine trees offered shade. Ghost padded at his side, sniffing at small animals that scurried in the undergrowth. The air smelled of resin and fresh grass, a far cry from the ash and destruction he'd once known. He paused among the trees, letting the mild breeze brush his face. Every step seemed to drive home how far he was from the throngs of King's Landing, from the memory of the Iron Throne. Yet he felt no regret. He thought back to a conversation he'd had with Tyrion about the price of duty and the weight of love. In the end, he had chosen duty, and it cost him dearly. But the realm was better off now, or so he hoped. And here, in this corner of the world, a different sort of life had taken hold. He might never see Sansa again, nor Arya, nor hear the wit of Tyrion, but their fates were likely safer without him in the south. He prayed to the old gods that they were well. Ghost nudged Jon's hand, pulling him from his reverie. Ahead, Tormund emerged from behind a cluster of pines. He carried a fishing rod of sorts, a crude contraption with a line and hook, and a bundle of wriggling trout. "Thought I'd find you here, brooding like a pensive crow," Tormund teased, waving a fish in front of Jon's face. Jon smirked, batting the fish aside gently. "I'm not brooding." Tormund let out a hearty chuckle. "Fine thinking then. Care to join us for dinner? We're having fish stew. Figured you'd want a taste of the day's catch." Jon nodded. "I'd like that. They strolled back together, Ghost padding contentedly behind. As they neared the settlement, the sounds of life enveloped them. Hammers pounding as new cabins rose, voices calling out greetings. The splash of water as children played by the river. Jon's heart felt unexpectedly light. He realized he was smiling, a rare, unguarded smile that signaled not joy exactly, but acceptance. Over dinner by a communal fire, people laughed and chatted, passing bowls of steaming fish stew. Tormund regaled them with an exaggerated story of how he wrestled 3 trout at once, leaving half the group in stitches. Era rolled her eyes, but even she cracked a grin. Jon ate quietly, the hearty flavor of the stew filling him with warmth. When the meal ended and dusk settled in, Tormund and Era began discussing the next day's plans, scouting a possible trail to the nearby hills where they'd spotted goats. Others drifted off to their huts, the night breeze carrying snippets of conversation and occasional laughter. Jon remained by the dying embers of the fire, gazing into the glowing coals. Ghost curled at his feet, and the stars emerged overhead, countless pinpricks of light in the northern sky. A young boy, no more than 10, approached timidly, carrying a clay mug of water. He offered it to Jon with a shy smile. "You looked thirsty," he said, voice trembling with nerves. Jon accepted the mug and thanked him softly. The boy lingered, twisting his fingers. "Is it true you fought white monsters and came back from the dead?" Jon hesitated, not wanting to spin tales, but he saw the boy's earnest curiosity. "I fought the White Walkers, yes. Many of us did. They were dangerous, but we beat them back." The boy's eyes went wide. "My mother says you're a hero." Jon's throat tightened. He shook his head gently. "No, just a man who did what needed to be done." The boy nodded as if absorbing a great wisdom, then scampered away into the night. Jon watched him go, heart heavy and light at once. The free folk had never believed in the same feudal ideals as Southerners, yet they'd come to see him as something akin to a leader even if he wore no crown or sigil. Perhaps that was as close to a happy ending as one could get, living among people who chose to respect you without the chains of lords and titles. In the stillness that followed, Jon finished the water and set the mug aside. The sky above shimmered with countless stars, and the faint glow of the moon outlined the silhouettes of nearby pines. The true north seemed vast, unending, full of secrets and possibilities. He inhaled deeply, letting the sense of pine sap and lingering smoke settle into him. He closed his eyes, thinking of Ygritte for a moment, the time they'd shared in the wild, the sense of belonging he'd felt. Ygritte had once said he knew nothing, but perhaps now he knew enough to value the simpler life, free of the constant pull of power. He thought of Daenerys, too, her face lit by dragon fire and by kindness in different times, and how her memory would never truly leave him. She had wanted to break the wheel, but the cost had been too high. Maybe here, in this rugged realm, the wheel had already been broken, replaced by a communal bond. He opened his eyes. Ghost watched him, ears flicking. Jon reached out and scratched the dire wolf behind the ear. "We'll be all right," he said softly, uncertain whether he spoke to Ghost or to himself. In the calm hush of Stonewater Vale, it felt like a prayer, a benediction for a man who had wandered countless roads, faced the darkest terrors, and loved and lost. Here, in the uncharted north, he might finally learn to live without the shadow of a throne. Rising slowly, he beckoned Ghost to follow. They walked back through the settlement, passing low huts where quiet conversation drifted through thin walls. No one rushed to bow or yield as he passed. A few called out simple goodnights or offered easy smiles. This was enough. Perhaps more than enough. Without fanfare or crowns, without grand declarations of destiny. Just a man among others, giving what he could and taking only what he needed. He ducked into his hut, the interior lit by the soft glow of a single candle. The sword he'd carried for so long rested in a corner, sheathed, silent, a relic of a world he'd left behind. In that moment, Jon knew the sword was still necessary, a tool to protect these people if more threats arose. But it no longer defined him. He spread out his fur blankets, feeling the day's weariness settle over him like a heavy cloak. Ghost padded in and curled up near the entrance, eyes half-lidded. Jon allowed his head to sink onto the rolled-up cloak he used as a pillow. The candle flickered, dancing with the faint drafts that slipped through the hut's gaps. Eventually, he pinched it out and darkness embraced him. He listened to the hush of the night, distant laughter, the murmur of the river, the whispering wind among pine boughs. In that quiet, he felt an abiding sense of possibility. There would be more challenges, more hardships. Winters to endure, expansions to manage, perhaps even new foes from within or beyond the wall. But for now, he had found a corner of the world where he could do good without the weight of crowns or the madness of conquest. He had Tormund's fierce loyalty, Aera's steady guidance, and the collective spirit of the free folk forging something new out of an ancient land. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of his own heartbeat fill his ears. In the darkness, he saw no dragons, no fiery destruction, only the dim outlines of a free future. And somewhere beyond the edge of dreams, the old gods might be watching, or perhaps the swirling auroras in the northern sky. Either way, Jon Snow felt, for the first time in a long, long while, a measure of peace as he drifted into sleep, the cold wilderness outside cradling him like a promise that he had finally come home.